I'll have a number 4 meal with extra cheese, 2 Big Macs with a large fry, 3 apple pies, and a shamrock shake. Alright Stan, your total comes out to $46.50. The land whale grunted approvingly as he shoved a greasy wad of crumpled bills into Gary's outstretched palm. Here's your change. I'll call your number when it's ready. Stan trundled away to await his late night snack as Gary and I prepared the food. Geez, man, does he have a family waiting at home? Or something, I whispered as Gary shoveled fries into a red and yellow box. Blair, does that man look like he's got a wife and kids? Stan is one of our regulars. You'll see him pretty often if you stick with the night shift. I grimaced as I prepared the shake. Great, lucky me. Hey, it could be a lot worse. Honestly, Stan is the least of your worries, he said as a shudder rippled through his body. We processed the remainder of the food in silence. Gary and I then shuffled to the counter, each donning a full tray. Stan, orders up, Gary exclaimed, as the boulder of a man darted at an alarming speed to retrieve his sodium-rich smorgasbord. He snatched the trays from us, hurriedly ambling back to his corner table. I watched in astonishment as the man inhaled his meal. Hey, could you help me sweep in the back? Best to do it now before any more customers. Gary was interrupted by an obnoxiously loud alarm blaring from his pocket. Stan looked up at him, glowering at the unwelcome ringing. Sorry, gotta take this, he said, darting to the kitchen and out of view. He returned a moment later. All the color had drained from his face. He appeared sickly, like he'd suddenly caught a nasty case of the flu. That was my aunt, Norma. She said my parents were in a car wreck. Apparently my mom is in critical condition. He stared off into space, his brain slowly processing the tragic information it had just received. Gary, I'm so sorry. Do you need me to call someone? He snapped out of his trance, tears brimming in the corners of his eyes. He quickly wiped them away. No, I'll be fine. Okay, but with all due respect, what are you still doing here? Go be with your family, dude. I can handle closing up on my own. He locked eyes with me, a stern determination creeping over his countenance. You're right, I need to go. Here, take my key to the restaurant. There's a list of rules in Dave's office. Go read them the first chance you get. You need to follow them to a T, no matter how ridiculous they sound. Got it? Yep, I'll take care of it. Now go, I said as Gary handed me a small silver object. He sprinted out the front door, letting it slam shut behind him. I fashioned Gary's drive-through headset below my hat and headed to the back to familiarize myself with the nighttime protocols. I laboriously pushed open the door to Dave's office. You'd think that thing was made from solid gold with how heavy it was. I surveyed my surroundings, my eyes immediately falling to the life-sized portrait beaming back at me. Really, Dave, even I'm not that self-absorbed, I muttered, continuing my search. I defaulted to the pockmarked bulletin board to my right. There they were, posted clear as day. I swiftly scanned over them. Rules for the night shift. 1. You are allowed a 7-minute grace period. No exceptions. 2. If a hooded figure knocks at the drive-through window, do not answer it. Stay out of its direct line of sight, and it will leave. 3. If Stan claims that you forgot his pickles, offer him a free complimentary chocolate shake. If he refuses, lock yourself in the office and call Dave. 4. No outside food or drink. 5. If a blood-like substance begins seeping from under the grill, mop it up until it stops. No, it is not blood. 6. An old woman in a shawl will come in exactly 10 minutes past 1. Avoid looking at her for too long. She will not leave until you ask her where Tony is. 7. If a small child appears telling you he lost his mother, ignore him. He does not have good intentions. 8. You are required to comply with the employee dress code. Speak to management if you need clarification on what is acceptable. 9. If you are alone and you feel the undeniable sensation of being watched, lock yourself in the office immediately and wait for it to dissipate. 10. The store closes at 2 a.m. Before you clock out, place 2 packages of raw burgers on the stove. 11. Always leave the restaurant by 2:37 a.m. The Hamburglar doesn't like company. 12. Failure to adhere to these rules will result in immediate termination. Do not hesitate to call Dave if you have any questions or concerns. Dave's phone number was hastily scrawled at the bottom of the page. I stared at the list, unsure of what to make of it. Was this some sort of cruel prank on the newbie? Maybe Gary was in on it. I resolved to wait and find out for myself, and I made my way back to the counter. Upon seeing me approach, Stan rapidly stood from his seat and sidled up to me. "Can I help you with something?" "Yeah, you forgot my pickles." I mentally rolled my eyes. Gary hadn't been gone for 10 minutes, and the fun was already ramping up. "Look, I watched my coworker make those. I know he didn't," I began, before Rule 3 crept into my head. I'm sorry. I can offer you a free shake for the inconvenience." His four chins flapped as he fervently shook his head. "No, I don't want any more food. There is another way you could make it up to me though." A malicious grin inched across his face, a blanket of fear sent adrenaline bursting through my veins. "I'm 16, sir. If you really think." "That's not what I meant, you dumb broad. I want a refund." "What? No, you already ate it all." "Fine. If you won't give me my money back, I'll have to take it from you." The massive mound of flesh began wobbling to meet me behind the counter. I fled to the back, praying he wouldn't catch me. I glanced behind me as I struggled to push open the absurdly heavy office door. Stan was barreling toward me, sending shelves of product crashing to the ground. My heart thumped against my ribcage so hard that it hurt. I had just managed to slip through the door and slam it shut when he reached it. Thud. He pounded his ape-like fists against the sturdy metal frame, shouting obscenities at me all the while. "I'll get you, you little wench. You can't stay in there forever." He was right. I instantly ripped the yellowing piece of paper from the board and punched in Dave's number. He picked up after an agonizingly long minute of waiting. "Hello, this had better be good. I value my beauty sleep." "Dave, it's Stan. The free shake didn't work. I'm trapped in the office." Dave sighed. "All right, put it on speaker and hold your phone up to the door so he can hear me." I obliged, clenching my cracked iPhone 7 with a vice grip and sticking it close to the rattling door. Stan, can you hear me?" "It's Dave." The room fell eerily silent. "Oh yeah, what's up, Davey?" "Stan, are you harassing one of my employees again?" "I don't need to get Mrs. Barrett on the phone, do I?" No, please. I'll behave, I swear. Please, just don't call her." His voice trembled as he spoke. "I don't know. That's what you said the last time. I promise I'll never bother her again." "Come on, Davey, show a little compassion." Dave took a moment to respond. "All right, but I need you to go home. And you need to apologize to Mrs. Blake for scaring her." "Blair," I interjected, facepalming myself. "Right, apologize to Blair, and I'll let you off the hook." "Oh, thank you. Sorry, Blaze. So, can I take you up on that free shake?" "No, Stan, no free shake tonight. I need you to leave," Dave said, a stern finality in his statement. Without another word, Stan angrily tromped through the kitchen and out the front door. I didn't release my breath until I heard it shut behind him. "Thanks, Dave. Anytime, kid." In my experience, threatening to call his mother is a decent deterrent for any overgrown man baby. I chuckled, sensing the tension disperse. "I'm gonna get back to bed now. Good luck tonight." And with that, he abruptly hung up. I sat for a moment, controlling my breathing in order to steady my palpitating heart before returning to my duties. I trudged into the kitchen and begrudgingly got to work cleaning the mess of boxes and condiments that Stan had strewn throughout the area. I had just put the final ketchup bottle in its place when out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure was standing at the drive-through window. I immediately tensed up, every muscle in my body freezing in place. It glared at me, yellow glowing eyes piercing the darkness. It raised a gloved fist and knocked lightly on the thin glass. The sound freed me from my stupor. Roll 2. I dashed to the counter and crouched behind it, hugging my knees to my chest. Ice flooded my veins. As the knocking grew louder, the window shook in its frame. As the light knocks soon escalated to rapid pounding, I squeezed my eyes shut, terrified at the notion that the slim barrier to the outside world wouldn't hold. The constant noise assaulted my eardrums, crashing against them like thunder during a storm. The knocking raised in volume to a fever pitch of resounding slams. Just when I thought that I might lose my sanity, it stopped. I glanced up in the midst of the unsettling silence I found myself in. It was gone, as if the entity had never appeared in the first place. I gradually stood and took my time getting my bearings. I hesitantly peeked around the corner at the drive-thru. Nothing, not so much as a scratch on the glass. I glanced down at my phone. 12:15 a.m., less than 2 hours. I could handle it, right? I began sweeping like Gary was beginning to ask me to do prior to receiving his unfortunate news. I was thankful for a break in the action. I didn't know how much more I could take. Apparently I could take a lot more, as I came to find out. A couple of college kids stumbled in, trying to hide the fact that they were obviously stoned out of their minds, and retrieved a pickup order. I watched as they clumsily staggered out the door. One of them held it politely for a small old lady, an old lady wearing a shawl. She didn't utter so much as a thank you, beelining up to the register with purpose. I was exhausted, up well past my normal operating hours, so I had completely forgotten about the rules. Big mistake. The woman glowered up at me, face obscured from view. Her head covering was black as well as the rest of her outfit, not unlike a ninja you'd see in a movie. The aura she radiated frightened me, but not enough to release me from my sleepy haze. "Hello, how can I help you?" I yawned, lazily covering my mouth. The woman didn't move a muscle. She scowled at me, yellow reptilian eyes piercing my psyche and sending my heart into overdrive. "Ma'am, would you like to order something?" "Nothing." The longer we continued our staring match, the more sedated I felt, and not just due to the lack of sleep. She had some sort of strange pull over me. I nearly nodded off, my mind wandering back to the instructions. Before I passed out, I murmured, "Where's Tony?" Suddenly, I was released from my trance, and the woman was nowhere to be found, like she had simply vanished into thin air. My eyes widened. That was close, too close. I trudged to the sink and splashed some cool water in my face, then poured myself a large cup of coffee. I knew it would probably keep me up well past closing, but hey, if it helped me avoid another incident like that, I was all for it. I had just finished dumping the dustpan into the trash when I felt it. A peculiar sensation crept over me like bugs crawling on the back of my neck. I was being watched, but from where? I sensed it coming from the drive-thru. I whipped my head in its direction. Empty. It shifted to the dining area. No one was there. I grew lightheaded, and panic began to surge through my system. A breeze swept past my ear, and I swear I could hear a soft, almost imperceptible voice whisper, "Blair." I bolted to the office, slamming the door shut as quickly as I could. What was that? I paced around the office like a caged animal, anxiously waiting for something, anything to happen. After what felt like an eternity, it began to dissipate without incident. I sat there for a moment, contemplating if this was really the right career path for me. Was every night like this? I was snapped back to reality by static emanating from my headset. I ripped it off until the noise stopped. A bumbling male voice crackled through it. "Hey, is this place open?" He slurred, obviously under the influence. "Yeah, what do you want to order?" I was beginning to lose my cool. Between all the strange occurrences and the inebriated customers, my patience was wearing thin. "I'll have a filet-o-fish meal." Coming right up, I made my way back to the kitchen and began preparing his order. Who the hell comes to McDonald's at 1:30 in the morning for a freaking fish sandwich? I grumbled, purposely dousing his sandwich in sauce. I served the man, hoping to be rid of him as soon as possible. "Thanks. Hey, is that a kid at the counter?" I turned my head, and sure enough, there he was, a mess of blonde tangles, and deep blue eyes peered at me from the register. I sighed. "Yeah, I'll take care of him. Have a good night." A child, unaccompanied in my restaurant. Just what I needed. I began to approach the counter when Rule 7 blared in my mind like a tornado siren. I froze mid-stride. "Just ignore him, Blair. It's almost 2. You got this," I reassured myself, starting my closing duties early. That was easier said than done. The child began wailing, shrill high-pitched screams reverberating off the walls. He ran into the kitchen area, allowing me a full view of his tiny frame. The boy couldn't have been older than 6. His Pac-Man t-shirt looked well outdated, and he was filthy, as if he hadn't showered in years. He began tugging on my shirt, begging for attention. "Please help me, lady. I can't find my mommy," he cried, tears streaming down his rosy cheeks. He was relentlessly pulling at my clothing. That was it. I'd reached my breaking point. If this child, monster, demon, whatever he was, planned on killing me, he could go ahead and put me out of my misery. I was done. Get out. Just screw off. And leave me the hell alone. He immediately quit sniffling and straightened up as if I'd flicked a switch. Red tinged his striking pupils. Dread began sinking into my gut. A malicious grin blossomed across his lips. "You made the right choice," he growled as he headed toward the exit. "Weirdo kid," I mumbled, returning to cleaning. I finished up and waited around for 2 to hit, praying for a quiet, uneventful end to my first nightmare closing shift. Of course, my prayers went unanswered. I had a mere 3 minutes until I was supposed to clock out when I spotted it. A dark red viscous liquid oozing from beneath the stove. Great, awesome, just what I needed. I filled up a mop bucket in the storage closet and began sopping up the mystery fluid. If it wasn't blood, you could have fooled me. A persistent copper taste assaulted my tongue every time I opened my mouth. I gagged, forcing vomit back down my throat. The stuff just wouldn't stop coming. On my 3rd bucket full of sloshing crimson, I finally started gaining an upper hand. I mopped fervently as blisters erupted across my hands. From the friction of the wooden handle, all the not blood had been disposed of. I breathed a sigh of relief, careful to avoid splashing myself as I dumped the last of it down the drain. I'd done it. Take that, bitches. I win. I cheered as if I'd just claimed first prize at the Indy 500. My celebration was short-lived once I glanced down at my phone. 2:35 a.m. I bolted to the freezer, scooping up a couple bags of frozen patties. I slashed them open as quickly as I could, hoping in vain that I'd be able to make it out in time. I dumped their contents on the grill, then turned to toss the packaging in the trash. My heart plummeted into my gut. A man stood before me. His black dead eyes matched that of the small mask encompassing the top half of his face. Wispy red hair sprouted from his floppy hat. A matching tattered black and white striped uniform framed his features, accompanied by a dingy red tie dotted with images of burgers. He grinned at me, jagged rotten teeth sending a chill undulating through my entire body. He spoke, a rough gravelly voice shattering the tense silence. "Look, I know you're new here, so I'll spare you this time. But if I ever catch you in here this late again, I won't think twice about increasing my calorie intake." His wicked smile exuded a malevolent hunger that still haunts my nightmares. A wet gray tongue wormed its way around his cracked, withered lips. I felt like a mouse about to be devoured by a rattlesnake. He scowled at me. "What are you still doing here? Get out." I suddenly regained my mobility. I tore through the dining area and burst into the cool night air. The Hamburglar's soulless stare followed me into the vacant parking lot. I hurriedly locked him inside and raced to my car as a torrent of emotions flooded through me at once. Fear, anger, and confusion were all prominent on my desolate drive home. In the end, rage won out. I wasn't scheduled the next day, but I was determined to make that smug prick in charge at least give me some sort of explanation. I returned to the Golden Arches around 4 hours later, running on 0 sleep. In a whole pot of Maxwell House, with fire in my eyes, I flung the door open and marched straight to Dave's office. Oh yeah, it was great. Had his car repossessed and everything. "Oh, hey Blitz." "Yep, for the last freaking time, it's Blair. Blair. Not Blitzen, not Blaziken, not Blakely. Blair." Dave furrowed his brow, mouth slightly agape. "Yeah, Jim, I'll have to get back to you." He ended the call and furiously pocketed his phone. "Do you even know who that was? I mean, why the hell do you think you can just storm into my office like this?" "No, you listen to me, Davey boy. I just had the worst night of my life. Every weird thing that could have happened, happened. And you don't care one bit. I see you've become acquainted with our more troublesome clientele." "Yeah, I have, and I'm not dealing with that crap again. I quit," I hissed, dramatically slapping my hat onto his polished cedarwood desk before turning to walk out the door. "Wait, 25 an hour." I stopped dead in my tracks. I reluctantly faced him. A sly, toothy grin was stamped on his greasy face. I mulled it over. That was almost double what I was currently making. I could have my college paid for in no time. 27 and you've got a deal. You drive a hard bargain, Mrs. Blair. "I accept," he said, extending his hand. I begrudgingly shook it, cringing as his sweaty palm gripped mine. "I'm glad you were able to see reason. Welcome to the night crew." The older officer looked kind, almost fatherly. He set the coffee cup down in front of me and sat down with a good-hearted smile. I pulled the survival blanket closer around me and did my best to smile back. "That should see you right. You must be chilled to the bone," Martin said. "Truth is you're lucky to be alive." "I know," I said, my voice quiet, before adding thank you. You don't need to thank us, it's what we signed up for. But I would like to ask you what happened out there, if that's okay. Seeing the look on my face, he leaned back a little, giving me some space. I understand that this is hard, but we need to make sure none of this ever happens again to our trainees. I glanced around before I answered, taking in the small, windowless room they'd brought me to. On the boat back, they'd asked some questions, as they treated me, but once I was back on land, there had been hushed conversations and calls being made. Mentions that I was new to the team, still in training. The officer in front of me, Martin, had led me here once I was able to walk, and this is where I'd been since. There are dangers out at sea, Oliver, you know this. We just want to make sure that you're okay, body, mind, and soul. The kindly smile he offered was at odds with the closed door, but I hesitantly began to speak. I was being stupid, really stupid. We were running some speedboat drills, slamming it through the big waves at speed, taking advantage of the storm to practice bad weather work. The rain and the spray were intense. Staff had instructed me to be spotter, so I was standing and looking for the target. I stopped again, not wanting to admit what I'd done. Martin looked at me, the wrinkles around his eyes asking me to trust him. I gathered myself and carried on. My life jacket, the strap was twisted and cutting into my ribs. I thought it would be okay, just for a moment to unclip, if I was still holding the rail with my other hand. I looked up, desperate not to be judged, and so of course the boat bucks at that moment. Of course I've now only got one hand holding the boat, and I overbalance, and everyone makes mistakes, Oliver, Martin says, soothing. I've unbuckled my jacket before, we all have. He paused for a second as I took a sip of coffee to wet my dry lips. So what happened next? He pressed. I hit the surface screaming, so I was instantly swallowing water. I explained it all, the burning salt blinding me, filling my nose. The wake of the boat had tumbling me, sending me disoriented, and spinning into the darkness, the feeling of the life jacket being torn away, my clothes and shoes becoming as heavy as iron, as I desperately kicked for what I hoped was the surface. I described breaking into air for just long enough to suck in the wave that forced me back under. My training telling me that I had to get my shoes and jacket off so I could swim. The sleeve getting caught, tangling me, binding my arms. Lungs burning as I watched the surface recede as I sank through the yielding water beneath me, fighting my own convulsing throat that wanted to breathe air that didn't exist. I didn't even realize I was crying until I felt Martin's hand on my shoulder. That's awful, he said. It was a kindly gesture, but Martin was stiff. There was an intensity in his eyes that he was attempting to mask with his fatherly demeanor. You sound like you were in a lot of trouble. How did you get back to the surface? My mind flashed back, forcing me to relive the experience. The ocean had become dark so quickly, the dim light of the gray sky snuffed out by the heavy water that parted effortlessly beneath me. I wrenched against the fabric of my shirt, kicked uselessly with my booted feet, bitten my tongue, and tasted blood mixed with salt. All so futile. I'd gone to scream, one final defiance against the inevitability of death, when the world shifted around me. Something moved, something big, a presence so colossal that it had seemed like the darkness itself had taken form. I was sinking, a struggling, dying speck that fell unnoticed into the void, and then all at once the void turned, and it was like the ocean itself beheld me. Martin's eyes were piercing, as if he could see my thoughts through my silent memories. I wanted to tell him everything, but something inside me recoiled. My dry throat tightened in the stuffy air, and I shifted against the chair. I had my flotation device, the emergency one. I managed to get my arms to it and pull. It kept me alive until the boat found me. I tried. The lie hung in the room for a second, feeling almost like a physical presence. Martin paused, before smiling and sitting back down in his seat. In scruple, he grabbed a box of tissues and held them out to me. They didn't find a flotation device on you, he said as I dabbed at my face. Oh, I muttered. I think I dropped it just before they got to me. They're bright, deliberately hard to miss. Martin fixed me with a stare, and suddenly the air in the room felt very heavy. I swallowed into a neck like sandpaper. Very hard to miss, light on them and everything. And your story doesn't match what the rescuers saw when they got to you. I don't really remember. I tried. My tongue felt rough against the roof of my mouth. My coffee cup was empty, but Martin's friendly demeanor had vanished, and I didn't dare ask for more. They say they saw you kick slowly to the surface, coming from real deep down, that you stopped before you broke water, hovered beneath the surface for a moment or two. See, to me that doesn't sound like someone who's drowning. That sounds like someone who's not in any trouble at all, down there at least. The silence following his words was broken only by the hum of the air conditioner. I pulled in a difficult breath, feeling my lungs working hard in the stale room. I opened my mouth to speak, but Martin cut me off. Seafarers tend to be a superstitious lot. Oliver, there are stories that go back beyond memories of strange things in the ocean. Monsters, creatures, kraken, and sirens. You know all this. He moved forward in his chairs, so close that our knees touched. I instinctively pulled back slightly and wrapped the blanket tighter around myself. I've seen and heard strange things out there myself, things I can't explain, and wouldn't like to dare try. I'm only going to ask you this once, Oliver. What happened down there? Down there. The presence beneath me had shifted again. Immense. There was the smallest movement from it, barely a twitch, and the rush of water it created was like the spinning of worlds. The entire abyss beneath me rolled to fix me with its gaze, an unfathomable presence that pulled me down like a mote being devoured. I looked back, not knowing if this was real or something that had come from my dying brain. As my thoughts faded, I sent out one desperate and final plea for my life, and as I did I felt something squirm into my mind, a wet, ancient presence that writhed its way between my neurons and bound my soul in a freezing dark cocoon. And then my body had rebelled. The pain was too much, the acid in my blood driving my mouth to open against my will, the tearing, burning agony of salt water rushing into my lungs. And then, I'd breathed it out. The pain had disappeared, the panic had faded. I'd hung there in the darkness, still, silent, the heavy feeling of cold water washing in and out of my body, the only sensation I was aware of. The heavy feeling settled in my mind, unpleasant though not unwelcome. The presence, the being around me, retreated back, leaving me alone, alive. Martin was still staring at me, a vein in his forehead pulsing. I opened my mouth to answer, to say some lie. Instead, seawater gushed forth, soaking the front of the shock blanket. He stood up, his chair screeching harshly on the concrete floor. Well, I'd say that does it then, he said, looking at me with something between fear and disgust. Does what? What are you going to do with me now? I rasped out. My head swam as I stood as well, but I made sure that I stayed on my feet. I tasted ocean on my tongue. We're a military branch, Oliver. You'll be taken into custody and held somewhere safe. This isn't your fault, but you're dangerous now, and we can't have you wandering free. You've touched them. I'll personally see to it that you're comfortable wherever you end up. Who are them? Martin, what happened to me? What's going on? There was a hysterical edge to my cracked voice now, but Martin wasn't listening anymore. We'll get you safe, Oliver, then we'll explain everything. As the lock of the door clicked open, I knew that this was it. A man and a woman were entering the room, still only Coast Guard, both unarmed, but both looking serious. Martin had turned to them to speak, to tell them how I was to be held, but I was already moving, driven by fear, and instinct, and the powerful, all-consuming thirst. The new man hadn't been looking at me as I barreled into him, and he let out a choking wail as my forehead made contact with his nose. A split second later, I was pounding down the hallways, bursting out into daylight, looking around wildly as shouts and fast footsteps followed me. Without being consciously aware of making the choice, I span away from the road and pelted across the tarmac towards the beach. On land, I'd be trapped, hunted, found, but the sea offered safety. I fixed my eyes on the lapping waves and redoubled my speed, feeling the hot grit beneath my feet, the dry air rasping at my skin. The water would hide me. I would slip into the darkness and be gone forever. The gunshot rang out as I dived into the surf. I swam wildly, recklessly, throwing water behind me with my arms and thrashing my legs. The low roar of a boat engine came to me, but the water was getting mercifully deeper, the current stronger, and they couldn't catch me down here. Nothing could catch me down here. The icy water welcomed me back, accepting and shielding me as I fled. I've been down here for a few weeks now. The search operation went on for days, but they never stood a chance. Today, a tourist dropped their phone while paddleboarding, and I managed to scoop it up. Waterproof technology is wonderful nowadays. I'm writing this to let you all know that Coast Guard are hiding things from you. Come and discover them for yourselves. The sea is wide and welcoming, and there's room down here for all of us. There are things down here that love us, things that can help and guide us. Come and join me. The water is lovely. The door to the cellar was never to be touched. At least, that was what my dad had always said. He told us this was because we lived next to a river. The foundations of the house sometimes flooded, and this seeped into the cellar, making it dangerous down there. When it was at its worst, he told us the spaces beneath the house would fill up with several feet of water, and that for my sister and me, a trip down there would be fatal. I used to shudder at the thought of the water and the dark down there, mixing together into a black liquid, fingering its way beneath the floorboards. A silent intruder wetting the very foundations of our lovely home, ready to bring it down at any moment. I used to have nightmares about the water rising up through the floor, drowning me in my sleep. Looking back, it wasn't so strange that I focused on disturbed thoughts like that around that time. Our mother had died of cancer a few years earlier, and ever since then I had always expected the worst outcome in every situation. Of course, my dad said that as long as I stayed out of the cellar, my fears about the water were unwarranted. He told me not to worry, that he would have the problem fixed soon enough, though it might mean people would be coming and going from the house for a while. I remember the first day the men came to fix the problem. I was only 11 years old at the time, and my sister Heather was 7. We both watched 3 men dressed in unusual grimy yellow suits of rubber, and their faces covered in masks and goggles, make their way to the cellar door. My dad had told me to make myself scarce. While they worked, I was to play with Heather in the back garden, but I didn't listen. I stood behind the door of the kitchen at the end of our hall and watched the 3 men in rubber yellow suits open the cellar door. Heather peeked out from behind me, her red locks of hair hiding the rest of her face. She seemed more frightened of being caught by our dad than anything else, for not doing as he asked. But that wasn't what frightened me. The thought of the black water down there was enough to do that on its own. I just wanted it gone so I could stop being consumed with worry. The men closed the door behind them. They watched as my dad stood there at the cellar door. He was looking at his watch. He seemed agitated, but what got under my skin was the smell that made its way to us at the end of the hallway. The cellar door had been open only for a few moments, but it was enough for a disgusting, putrid stench to escape and make its way to our noses. I cupped my hand over my mouth and nose in disgust, but Heather let out a loud yuck. Dad spun around in our direction. I remember he looked paler than usual, but he didn't seem angry. He walked to the end of the hallway and told us in a gentle voice, "Right, my little spies, go and play while this gets taken care of." He looked at the old brown leather wristwatch he always wore as if time were against him. Heather asked if the men would make that horrible smell go away. He said they would, but it would take time. I took Heather by the hand, and we went out to the garden to play in the sun after that, just as Dad had instructed. The men came to fix the cellar more than once. These visits continued for a while, on and off. Machinery was brought into our home, long rubber hoses for pumping out the black water from down in the darkness. I remember seeing 2 of the men standing over the hose with their masks off outside. They were shaking their heads, and it seemed there was some disagreement about the best course of action, but I didn't hang around long enough to understand it all. I was a kid, and there was playing to be had. Dad later explained to us that the men had to pump out the water, then dry out the cellar with machines called humidifiers, and then they would try to fix the walls so the water wouldn't get in. But regardless of their efforts, the flooding kept happening. Although he tried to be outwardly calm, Dad seemed increasingly consumed by the situation. I could see the dark patches under his eyes getting more pronounced as the days wore on, and the worry seeping into his posture. It wasn't unusual for him to have dark moods. He'd understandably seemed weighed down ever since my mother had died, but the flooding brought with it another cold weight to add to his burdens. It seemed that he was desperate to fix the problem. Eventually, we were told that the men looking into the issue would have to dig up the back garden to try and put in drainage. Dad explained this was to stop the water from getting to the foundations of the house in the first place. Around that time, I overheard him talking to one of our neighbors, Mrs. Wright, telling her that if he couldn't make the water go away, he'd have to take me and Heather away from our home. That house was the only home I'd known, and so the mere mention of being taken from it created a warped feeling of instability that I know I never quite shook. Mrs. Wright, which seemed very concerned when talking to my dad, more so than seemed reasonable, but she whispered as she spoke to him, and so I didn't catch her side of the conversation. At night, I'd lie in bed and dream about the black water underneath my bedroom, swirling around out of sight. Sometimes I'd waken, a loud splash of water dragging me out of a terrible dream, and then there would be nothing but silence. In the dream, the water had a voice. This seemed to go on for weeks, as far as I recall, until one night I was woken up by something else, something worse. I was jolted from my sleep by the sound of a scream. I knew immediately that it was my dad's voice. At first I wasn't sure if the scream had been part of a nightmare, like the water seeping past the threshold to my waking mind. But this thought was answered quickly. The scream came again a few moments later, more panicked and agonized than before. After that, it stopped. Dad's bedroom was next to ours, but it didn't sound like the scream had come from there. It sounded like it had come from somewhere constrained, somewhere muffled and deep. Heather woke up and came rushing into my room. I'll never forget her asking, "What's happened to Daddy?" I got out of bed, took her hand, and we put on all the lights in the house we could. First my bedroom light, then the hall, then we went into my dad's bedroom. It was empty. The bed covers were pulled back. Staring at the vacant bed with disturbed blankets, I felt a gnawing in my chest. At 11 years of age, I knew to call the police when there was an emergency, but I didn't right away. I think it was because I hoped to find him somewhere else in the house. That Dad had put his back out and was lying on the couch. That had happened once before. We put the rest of the lights on around the house one by one. I felt like the lights would banish the fear growing inside of me, but they just made the house feel emptier than it should have. What made things worse was the smell. It was bad, especially in the hall. I remembered that smell. I knew that the only way the stench could have been there was if someone had opened the cellar door, even if just for the briefest of seconds. I moved along the hall to that door, Heather's hand in mine, her eyes filled with apprehension, gazing between long strands of red hair, our little bare feet making the slightest sounds against the cold carpet. "Dad," I shouted at the door, hoping he'd respond. But nothing came back to me, not even another scream. Anything would have been more comforting than silence. I stared at the door, fear swelling inside of me. I knew what had to be done. Heather tugged at my hand and begged me not to go down there. She was right, of course, but I was at that age where I constantly felt the need to prove myself. It would have been easier to have turned away and sought help, but that was not what happened. I leaned down and cupped my sister's face in my hands, gently moving her strands of red hair softly, resting them behind her ears. I looked her in the eyes and said, "Daddy will be okay." An empty promise, but it was all I had. Then I instructed her that she needed to go next door to Mrs. Wright's house and tell her about what had happened, that they should phone for the police and an ambulance, that Dad was missing, and that he'd hurt himself down in the cellar. "What are you going to do?" she asked. Her face cast an incandescent light and fear. I fed her a lie about waiting in the hall in case Dad came back up the cellar stairs, but I watched her reaction as I spoke those words. She didn't believe me, and yet she still did as I asked. Heather opened the front door and headed outside into the night. A rush of cool air came inside before she closed the door, but it wasn't enough to rid the hall of the putrid smell from the cellar. I knew Heather would be fine. Mrs. Wright's house wasn't far, just a short few steps out of the garden and through our neighbor's gate. She'd be looked after, and soon the police and ambulance would be there. In the intervening minutes, it was my duty to make sure my father was safe. I took being the oldest child seriously. Ever since Mom had died, Dad had drummed into me that if anything should ever happen to him, that I would have to be strong and take care of things. The thought of losing him shot a cold, damp feeling up my spine. When I was certain Heather was gone, I turned and thumped my hand on the cellar door, shouting, "Dad, are you down there?" I dreaded hearing silence again, but that is not what happened. In return, I did finally hear something. It was the sound of water trickling down there somewhere, shuffling around between the walls and open doorways of the cellar. It echoed slightly like a far-off dream, making me shudder. I imagined my dad clinging for dear life down in there as the water rose up and up and up until it was only an inch from his mouth. That thought pushed me forward. I had to save him. I put my hand on the door handle. Turning it, the handle clicked, and I slowly pulled the door open. The stench was overpowering. It made me feel sick. A strange smell of damp and grime. And something else I couldn't put my finger on, but a smell I'll never forget. Staring down to the bottom of the cellar steps, the place was in utter darkness. I thought that Dad must have taken his torch with him. I reached up to the side of me where a pole chain dangled from the ceiling. I wrapped my fingers around it and pulled until the lights came on. One solitary incandescent yellow bulb above the stairs, and then the dim glow of a few others in the cellar rooms below just out of sight. Looking down the stairs, I was shocked. There was no water down there. The bottom of the steps glistened, as though they were damp, but I could see the stone floor below them, and they looked dry. "Dad," I said again. A muffled sound, almost like a groan, came from somewhere further under the house. I recognized it as my dad's voice again. He was still conscious. Help rushed through me. "Do you need help, Dad?" I remember asking. It seems like a stupid question now looking back, but I remember wanting him to appear and climb the steps without me having to go down there. But that did not happen. His voice muffled a few words like his mouth wasn't able to fully form around them, and so I couldn't make them out. In my mind, I imagined him face down on the floor, needing me. I searched for all of the courage I could find and moved downward. The stone steps of the cellar lay silent. As I descended, icy cold against my bare feet, the smell of the place worsened as I reached the cellar floor, making me gag, and I wondered what could make such a terrible smell of damp. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I remember thinking, that's what the dead smell like. A dim glow of another light bulb further into the cellar lit something to the side of the steps. It glistened differently from anything else. I knew implicitly that it was blood. The sight of it filled me with anxious thoughts. I remembered cutting my head at school once when I fell in the playground months earlier. This blood seemed different somehow to that. More vivid, yet darker. A small puddle of it had gathered on the floor, and then there was a trail of it heading through an open doorway. I moved closer to the trail and saw, to my horror, that alongside it were what looked like bloodied footprints. I could see the impression of the sole and the occasional outline of the toes rendered in the same unnerving red on the cold cellar floor. My 11-year-old mind had to process everything. I stared at the glistening deep red and reasoned that Dad had gone down to the cellar during the night, barefooted, and then had an accident. "Dad, are you there?" I said out loud. What I heard from beyond the open doorway, where the blood trail led, sounded like him, but as though he were drowning, coughing on something, trying to speak. But there was another sound underneath that, like his mouth was broken and unable to work any longer, no matter how desperately he tried to use it to form words. He sounded in unbearable pain, and this spurred me into action. I rushed forward through the doorway, the blood spattering underneath my shoeless feet. The room was completely empty except for what appeared to be old rags bundled in the corner, covering something. The bundle was large and wet, cast in red. I realized this was because the nearest light bulb was covered in blood. On the walls were handprints, as though my dad had tried to scramble up them, trying desperately to get to his feet. Or get away, I thought. The rags in the corner moved subtly, almost like whatever they were concealing shivered. The stench coming from the bundle was so strong I would have vomited if it weren't for the fear coursing through me. Then a glint of something shiny caught my eye. It was among the undulating cloth. I only saw it for a second, but I knew what it was immediately. It was the dial of my dad's wristwatch. I remember trying to say Dad, but my voice trembled so much I couldn't get the words out. I couldn't help but fear the worst, that what was moving beneath those rags was all that was left of my father. My mind couldn't quite grasp what I was looking at, and yet I still approached, wanting to help my dad in any way I could. As I neared the bundle slowly, I saw a set of fingers poking out from the mass of rags. They looked yellowed, but they moved, writhing and grabbing hold of the cloth around them like they were in agonizing pain. Inside of the mass of material somewhere, I heard Dad try to speak again, but the words remained a broken mess. Tears welled up in my eyes. I couldn't understand what had happened to him. All I could think about was the pain my dad was in. I knew I couldn't wait for an ambulance. I stepped forward and reached out my hand to touch what remained of his. But when I was within inches of touching him, the fingers lurched out from the rags and grabbed hold of my hand. They latched on like fishing hooks, digging their greasy nails into the skin. I let out a cry, first of pain, and then of disbelief. A hand wasn't attached to a wrist or arm, but something that resembled bone covered in black mold. I saw the bend in the middle, like an elbow, but it moved both ways like a dislocated joint. The rags quivered and slid across the floor towards me as the hand kept me in place. They reached my feet and wrapped themselves around my ankles. Then I saw a mouth with blackened teeth protrude from the bundle, and something resembling a glistening tongue licked over them, gasping out a sickening, warm, and wet breath. I stared in utter horror at the mouth as it spoke words I couldn't understand, the voice of my father still there, but senseless. Then a thought spread across my 11-year-old brain like an electrical storm. That thing is going to eat me. It slid forward, a sea of hands, then grabbed me, but not from the thing on the floor, but instead from behind me. I heard familiar voices, the voices of neighbors, shouting in terror as they tore with their bare hands at the rags, bone, and flesh attached to me. I heard another set of footsteps running. Someone then stabbed the thing with a large kitchen knife. I heard the scream again, the same scream that had woken me, my dad's scream. My dad in agony, emanating from the blackened mouth at the center of the rags. The sound of cracking and wet cartilage and ligament tearing came as the grown-up snapped one of the thing's bones, and with an almighty tug, my neighbors finally wrenched me away from the bundle of rags as it screamed at us with hate. A rush of footsteps sped me off. Warm, safe arms carried me up the steps, the strong arms of Mrs. Wright, our neighbor. She held me like I was her own child, carrying me at speed out of the dim red-tinged room and into the hallway above. I turned my head and nestled into her shoulders, then saw the other neighbors, 4 of them, slamming the cellar door shut and then barricading it with pieces of furniture. They backed away from it as if expecting the thing in the cellar to burst through at any moment. Heather was next door being looked after by Mr. Wright, but I was kept close due to my ordeal, pretending to sleep in those safe arms. For 2 hours, I sat in our house, in the kitchen, listening to the grown-ups talk, their faces filled with expressions of worry and fear. Secret, they said. No one should know. Came another. Hide the entire thing, another said. My panicked, traumatized mind couldn't put any of it together. All the while, the thing that was all that was left of my dad, screamed from down in the darkness. A hungry, agonizing scream I will never forget, mangled with the sound of rushing water in the cellar that, from their worried glances to each other, was plainly audible to everyone present. A plan was set, though I was in too much shock to take it in. They debated what should be done, but seemingly came to their senses eventually. They phoned the police, but by the time the flashing lights came and the officers walked down beneath the floorboards to see what was there, a fresh flood had entered the cellar from the river. When the water was pumped out by the morning, nothing was found. No blood, no thing of rags and bone, no thing at all. My dad was gone. I never shared what happened that night with Heather, what I saw down there in the darkness beneath our home. I didn't want to scare her, to hurt her. She was going through enough as it was. She had lost her mother and now her father. They were orphans. She didn't need to know the rest. The pain of grief would be enough of a struggle. After a police investigation, and due to my dad's body never being found, along with our neighbors trying to persuade me that my memories of the cellar were nothing more than a fevered night terror, the official conclusion was that Dad must have run out on us. But I knew better. I couldn't see any situation where he would have abandoned us. The neighbors, they knew even better than that. They knew exactly what had happened, far more than Heather or I did. It turns out I was kept in the dark for years. The neighbors hid the truth from the world. They let Heather and I get on with our lives, without burdening us with it. I'm still not sure whether they did that to protect us, or protect themselves. Perhaps a little of both. We moved away after Dad's disappearance to live with our grandmother and, in time, were able to live a happy enough life. Though I never forgot what happened. It was etched into my mind forever, along with the sound of rushing water in my dreams. Sometimes it felt as though the black water called to me. In dreams I would imagine it swelling up from deep below my bed and rushing over my body, dissolving me away to nothing. It wasn't until recently, 17 years after the event, that some answer, no matter how perplexing, was given for all the horrors swirling in my head since that night. A watch was found by some people doing magnet fishing in the river near our old house. It had an engraving on it with my dad's initials. This discovery was brought to my attention when the police returned the watch to me. I only had to glimpse at it to confirm, without a doubt, that it was his, the same watch I had seen in that mess of bones and rags in the cellar. I was confused by how it could have gotten into the river from the cellar if indeed my memories were accurate. And the watch, it held another secret, one that urged me to confront the neighbors who had been there the night the water in the cellar had taken my dad away. Through all those years, I had thought the neighbors wanted to hide what happened because it was just too strange to be believed. But another possibility had been making itself known in my mind months after the discovery of the watch, that they wanted to hide what happened because of something much darker, something they feared. I called them to meet together, but none of them came, except for the now gray-haired Mrs. Wright. She reluctantly agreed. Gathering around my dining table in my current home, I laid my dad's watch in front of her, asking her to tell me the truth. I demanded it. I deserved it. Just what had happened to him. What had turned him into that collection of rags and bones? Why was he never found? I wish I had never asked those questions. Some answers can never be forgotten. I'll tell you what Mrs. Wright told me. She said that Dad's life had been one mired in tragedy. Our own mother had died of cancer when Heather was very young. This I knew. I still remembered the overwhelming grief of her loss, but what I didn't know was that Dad had been married to someone else before then. They had even lived in that same house before he met my mother. Dad's previous wife had given birth to a young girl. Her name was Orla. Orla was born with severe learning difficulties, and Dad always seemed to struggle with this reality. He grew distant from her. It turns out that one day, when still only a young teenager at the time, Orla managed to climb out of the garden, through some woods, and then down to the river. Dad was supposed to be keeping an eye on her. Several witnesses saw her down there. Dog walkers, people out for a stroll. They didn't know that, despite being 15 years of age, that she had the mental capacity of a 3-year-old, and so they never approached her as she sat on a large rock by the riverbank, dangling her feet in the water, smiling happily. As the river splashed around her ankles, the worst kind of tragedy then followed. She vanished. Orla's body was never found. Despite an extensive search of the river, it was assumed that she had drowned, and then her body had been washed miles away, perhaps even out to sea. Mrs. Wright said that Dad mourned terribly, and then he began to act strangely. He started telling neighbors that Orla was calling to him from the river. He would spend hours down there sitting on the same rock where she had been last seen, even though his wife begged him not to. Though she grieved just as bitterly, she wanted them to get on with their lives. This was something Dad refused to do. The neighbors would see him down there at the edge of the water. He would talk to his reflection, as though he were talking to Orla herself. Eventually, he had a full breakdown and had to be committed. His wife could no longer cope and left him. Mrs. Wright stayed close friends with him during that time. She said it took a couple of years for Dad to recover, and then something transformed his life. He met our mother at a support group for grieving parents. Yes, I was shocked to learn that our mother had lost a child, too. A boy named Sam, killed by a terminal disease not unlike the one that took her from us years later. Dad and Mom bonded, and they helped each other through their pain, eventually having more children, me and then Heather 4 years later. For a time, they were happy. Maybe they would have told us eventually what had happened in their past when we were old enough. That once, a long time ago, we had a sister named Orla and a brother named Sam. Before our mother died of cancer, Dad promised her in front of Mrs. Wright that he would never go back down to the river once she was gone. She was worried he would have another episode and not be able to look after us. He gave that promise, and to my knowledge, he never stepped foot near that river again. Unfortunately, Mrs. Wright revealed that in the months before his disappearance, Dad's mental health issues seemed to be coming back. He talked to her about what was going on with our house. He was fixated on a singular fear, manifested in dreams, that haunted him. A fear that if he wouldn't go back to the river to see his daughter, then the river would seek him out. Dad then started to complain about a stench of damp coming from the cellar, but none of the neighbors smelled it when visiting, and they didn't have any issues with flooding in their own cellars. No one else even saw the water, and when I thought about it, I had never seen it either. Despite this, Dad called out contractors time and time again to fix the constant flooding down there. They took his money, even setting up elaborate pumping equipment to keep him happy, but they never found a single drop of water down there. The cellar was bone dry. In fact, the only time it did indeed flood was the night I was attacked by the ragged thing beneath the floorboards. The night any trace of my dad disappeared. Mrs. Wright ended the conversation by saying the strangest of things. No matter how much I pressed her on it, she wouldn't explain it any further. Paraphrasing, she said, "Your father was a good man, but the water in that river is tainted. It flows strangely, it always has. A river is only ever as clean as its source, and locals have said for years that it comes from a bad place. I stay clear of it myself. Some of the other neighbors do, too. You might think it's superstition, but I'll tell you, that water changed your father that night in the cellar. But make no mistake, it wasn't the first time it corrupted him into being, or even doing something truly evil. I can't bear the thought of what that might mean." I don't know where to start this. It's hard to really put into words just how shocking this event has come off to me. I guess the best place to start would be to explain what happened. When I was around 10 years old, I had a loving dog named Jacko. He was a husky, and we would go for walks almost every day. One day, however, his rope snapped. He must have seen a squirrel or another small animal, and he ran off into the woods to chase it. I remember running home in hysterics and explaining what happened to my dad. He yelled at me, but eventually he went out to his truck and went out to find him. He was gone for around 5 hours, and when he came back, I could tell from his red face and his angered expression he hadn't found Jacko. Even though I could tell he wasn't coming home, I attempted to ask him if he found my loving dog. "Dad, did you find Jack?" I was immediately slapped in the face and sent off to my room to bed. I was crying into my pillow all night. Jacko was an amazing dog. I had never loved something more until the night he ran off. I remember his bright red collar with a brass pendant labeled J.O. It had a little dog paw print above his initials. Fast forward to now. I am 55 years old and have been working as a dentist for the past 21 years. I was going outside to collect the mail when I heard the sound of barks and twigs snapping. That was when I remembered Jacko. God, it had been so long since I thought of him. My heart was aching as I went inside and read through my mail. I spoke to myself as I went through them. Bill, and more bills. Finally, the last envelope revealed itself. The paper was tinted yellow, clearly signifying how old it was. It had an old red wax stamp that had been burdened with time. It was slightly chipped. I read the date on the envelope, 1978. I was confused. I decided to open it, and to my amazement, it was a letter from my grandpa. My grandpa had died long ago when I was around 17. When I read the letter, each sentence made me feel like crying more and more. "Hey, Felix, I'm really sorry about Jacko. He was a good boy. I'm sure he will come back to you someday. He's probably out there chasing squirrels. I hope this letter reaches you and doesn't get stuck in processing or any of that stuff. Sincerely, Gramps." That last sentence broke the somber mood as I chuckled to myself. The irony of the situation lightened my day as I started to get ready for work. I checked my phone, 6:34 a.m. I had work in about half an hour, so I went and got some coffee ready while I went into my bedroom. As I walked into my room, I was greeted with a sight that made me feel at home. My bedroom reminded me of my childhood. The old ugly wallpaper, the yellow stained tiles, and the amazing smell of mustiness greeted me like a warm embrace. I was happy here. As I was getting ready, I heard more barking. I recognized it. I couldn't pinpoint how exactly, but something about it was familiar. As I finally walked out of my bedroom, I stopped in my tracks. I realized what it was I recognized about that sound. It was Jacko. It was the same high-pitched mellow bark that I recognized from my childhood. I immediately rushed out my door. I ran to the back of the house. I frantically rounded the corner to see my childhood best friend laying in the dirt. Immediately, two details popped into my head, which made me go from happy to confused. I had moved around 700 miles away from my childhood home, and two, when Jacko ran off, he was around 5 years old. Dogs don't live that long. I thought maybe this was a different dog that sounded and looked like Jacko. That thought was immediately disproven as I noticed a bright red collar and a brass pendant around his neck. I ran up to him, and he didn't even seem fazed. He started to groan as I looked at the pendant. The initials read J.O. My hands were shaking so violently it looked like I was having a seizure. I immediately embraced my lost long best friend, but something felt wrong. He was way too cold even for the early morning weather. I sort of flinched, but I didn't care. I hugged him so tightly I felt my body ache. Finally, I got up and let him inside. He moved weirdly, almost like he was drunk. I chalked this up to his extremely old age, but I noticed how the collar seemed pristine. I immediately called into work and explained how I wasn't going to make it in because I wasn't feeling good. As I stood there on the phone, I noticed how my dog kept on bumping into things. I again thought it was old age. I couldn't believe I had found Jacko after all these years. The sleepless nights I endured over his disappearance. I couldn't help but tear up as I hugged him. That's when I noticed it. Jacko's eyes had turned into a brown color. I very vividly remember him having sapphire blue eyes. In fact, it was such a prominent feature that we nicknamed him Blue Eye at times. I was shocked. I didn't know how to react. My emotions were a mixture of curiosity, confusion, and fear. I sort of just stared at him as I analyzed his face. Everything about it seemed crooked. It was like he had been slowly morphed. I noticed patches of dark fur I hadn't before. His snout seemed more jagged, but the biggest detail was the teeth. They seemed far too sharp and narrow for a dog. I hadn't even seen this in wolves. I sort of pondered as I went to get him food and water. Everything raced through my mind at once. Thoughts like that's not your dog or how did he get here? I was so confused. I felt almost dazed as I brought the dishes of foul-smelling dog food and tap water to Jacko. I set it down and I watched as his previously sloppy demeanor changed into a fast, focused strut. He elegantly waltzed over to his meal and proceeded to devour it within seconds. Must be hungry, huh, Jacko? I said sarcastically. That joking mood changed into a serious one as he glanced from his food and stared right at me. He was looking into my eyes as I glared at him. As odd as this sounds, his eyes seemed human. I can't properly put into words. I looked at him, but right as I was about to look away, he groaned at me. Now I swear to you guys, I heard the word help come from that groan. It was like a whisper traveling in the room. I immediately felt sick as I backed away. I don't understand why I decided to do what I did next, but alas, some people make mistakes. In a moment of quick thought, I decided to keep Jacko with me. I thought all of this is just stress. None of this is serious. You probably just heard something. I really had no clue what was about to happen. Because I didn't have to work that afternoon, I decided that finishing up my basement would be a good idea. I had been working on this thing for over 5 months, and it was a perfect man cave. Hardwood floors, a massive TV. It felt like a perfect hangout place for someone like me. I even had a vintage Atari sitting there to relive my childhood passions. As I slowly crept down the steps, each creak, groan, and crack was making me feel nervous. I was still quite shaken up from Jacko's sudden appearance, and I had to think for a good minute about what to do. You obviously can't just take in an enormous husky after years and years of not owning a dog. I started to remember how long it had been since I had seen him last. 1978. That was simply not possible. If it was 2023 now, that means that Jacko would be 50 years old. I started to think, what if this was a completely different dog I just brought, and what if he's completely diseased? I started to worry as I shifted damp cardboard boxes in the basement. Each shift made me sort of flinch as I heard the familiar sounds of paws stomping on hardwood. I listened as Jacko slowly walked down those wooden stairs. I slowly turned around to see him. His tongue was hanging out. I saw black viscous liquid on his tongue, and I almost gagged. The room was filling up with a very pungent odor. Think of roadkill that's been left to rot in the summer. I started to gag even harder as I watched Jacko take very slow steps towards me. It reminded me of a wolf silently approaching its prey. Then I saw his collar, and all previous thoughts of this being a different dog were wiped away. And all I watched as he drove me into a corner. Jacko, calm down, boy. It's me, Felix. I watched as he perked his head to the side. His ears twitched. That's a good boy. Every word I spoke felt like a challenge. It was actually hard to think. I was so worried about him going crazy. I didn't even notice the silence. There were no more birds fluttering or calling, no more insects or bees. Hell, not even wind was swaying. I felt hopeless. I don't know why I dismissed the smell or the black liquid that was on my once beloved dog's tongue. I was just worried about being bitten. I outstretched my hand after a bout of thought and began to slowly stroke him. Even though he was clearly old and had been outside for decades, his fur still felt the same. It was so incredibly smooth. It felt like silk was caressing my hand. I watched as he began to calm down. I finally walked past him and led him up the stairs. I was contemplating calling a vet. After a few minutes of thinking, I decided that it was for the best. Hell, what if Jacko had rabies and he bit me? I shook the thoughts off and rang up our local vet. After a few minutes of discussing, we decided on an appointment for tomorrow. I sighed. Even a day with Jacko felt like torture. I was actually surprised. After so many years of missing and begging for my dog to come back, I was now contemplating making him go away. Eventually, it fell dark, and the feeling of tiredness swiftly overtook me. I got ready for bed and decided to check up on Jacko before I went to sleep. As I quietly tiptoed down the stairs, each slow step making me feel more on edge, that's when I heard a very distinct sound. It was like something wet slapping a hard surface. I could hear the echoes. It was coming from my basement. I felt a sense of dread pit deep in my stomach. As I slowly rummaged to find the door to my basement, I noticed something. The door was wide open. I very slowly began to make my way down the stairs. Every hair on my body started to stand up as I made it halfway down. It was so cold, I felt my body begin to shake violently. As this sound got louder and louder, it was reducing my mind to rubble. As I finally made it down, what stood in the corner of my basement will forever haunt me even as I lose memories. Jacko stood there silently on his hind legs. He had something in his mouth. The moon illuminated him through my basement window, and it revealed blood dripping from his teeth. Finally, I realized what it was. It was the collar of my dog. It had been ripped off of him, and still had clumps of fur and parts of his neck. It had blood staining it. I then immediately looked at this thing's neck to come to a horrible realization. That same collar was on its neck. This was not my dog that stood before me. I let out a yelp and silence washed over. My mind felt frozen as this thing turned around to see me. Its face was so horribly mangled. I could see little bits of mange littering its face like spots of paint. Its eyes, they were black. I could see my own reflection in them like they were a mirror. Then I watched as it dropped the collar of my now presumably dead dog as it approached me slowly. It walked like a human. I finally found the courage to get away, and I ran. As I made it up and out the door, that thing chased after me. It slammed into my glass sliding door, making it shatter. It let out a horrible yell. It stood between me and the only place I could now use as an escape. I did the only thing I could think of, and I ran up the stairs and went into my room. I slammed the door shut and locked it as I began to barricade myself with any loose furniture I could get my hands on. I ran over to my phone and began to dial 911. The feeling of hopelessness and sorrow only slightly fading away as the feeling of another person speaking to me came on the line. 911, what's your emergency? I felt relief as I answered. Listen, my dog has gone crazy. I am in my room right now trying to keep it away. It's somewhere in my house, I don't know where. Please just send help. I heard the sound of shuffling on the other line, then a response. All right, sir, make sure to stay on the line and keep out of sight, okay? Everything will be all right. What's your address, please? The sounds of horrible screams and rummaging began to litter the air like a pathogen as I continued on. 178 Mangrove Drive. Please send help. I don't know how much longer I can bear with this. That's when I looked out the window. I saw the face of my dog looking at me. I lost breath almost immediately. Its face began to warp into a human. Its skin was white. It began to smile at me. How is it this tall? Oh God, my dog is looking at me. It wants to kill me. Please send help. Oh my God, I said to the operator as I began to stare at this thing. It put its unnaturally slender hand up to its mouth and made a gesture of silence. I screamed, but that didn't last long as I felt the elevating sounds of this thing's horrible chuckling. I felt so alone. It kept on looking at me with its horrible grin. Its smile was so large that it stretched beyond my window. Then it showed me something that has me crying. While I write this, I watched in terror as its hand reached down and pulled something off the ground. It began to pull up a gray fur-covered body. It was Jacko. I could see the red collar on his decapitated body. I began to cry maniacally. Why was this happening? Was this all a dream? Sir, we are 2 minutes away, hang in there. The voice on the line echoed, as a feeling of hope began to fill my body. That quickly faded, as this thing began to put its hand to my window. I watched as it began to feel around before finally pulling it open. The squealing of the window finally reaching the top began to make me sob. I was ready to accept death. It took the body of my mangled dog and threw it into the room. It landed at my feet, blood pooling the carpet, making it look like red wine had spilled everywhere. I began to embrace my long-gone friend in my lap as I watched that thing smile at me. I heard its stomps as it began to walk away. I did not care for my life anymore as I sat there crying and hugging my dead best friend. Jacko, no, I quietly uttered as I held him in my lap. I heard the faded sounds of sirens begin to approach as I sat with Jacko. The rest of it is a blur. I woke up in the hospital. I don't know how, but I had cuts littering my body. I thought it was from me hurrying to barricade my door, or the glass from the initial impact of that thing slamming into my door. It's been 2 days now. I'm still in the hospital. I don't know what's happening. My house is being investigated on. I might be sent to jail under suspicion of animal abuse and neglect, but I'm not so sure. I love you, Jacko. I wish you never ran off. Last month, I was driving along the highway, coming back from a trip to my grandpa's house. I can't remember the exact second, but as I was driving, apparently a truck collided with my car, and I was knocked unconscious. While I was out, I fell into a dream, one that will stick with me. I need to type as many details as possible, so here's every single thing I remember. I was a 7-year-old boy, living in New Jersey rather than my real-world home state of Massachusetts. My parents would drop me off at a school I never went to in the real world, and I would play with friends I never met. 2024 and 2025 were calm, upbeat years for me. I didn't care much for world events, so I barely paid attention to the news. It was just my toys, Disney Plus, and my friends, Josh, Emily, and Ryan. We played war and crime-themed video games and watched hilarious videos on social media. 2026, however, was when things took a bit of a downturn. In March, my friend, Josh, died in a car accident, and they noticed his eyeballs were missing from their sockets after the wreck. I was shown a picture for God knows what reason, and I started to cry as I saw my friend's red eye sockets and lifeless face. That night, I kept my bedroom light on. I don't know exactly what time it was when this happened, but I was lying on my back, staring at the wall, when a pair of black pants popped up out of nowhere at the foot of my bed. Sidetracked, I looked up and saw a rusted face. The thing, whatever I saw, vanished as I made eye contact with it. My heart dropped and I called for my mom. I chalked it up to the thing having been a ghost. I brought it up to my friends, Ryan and Emily, the next day. Emily told me she was in the car behind the one Josh was in and saw a man with a rusted-looking face running towards the car, but for some reason she doesn't remember what happened next. Chills ran down my spine as I realized the man was real. Together, my friends and I decided he was a ghost we needed to avoid. This pact made me feel less alone, and being as afraid of the ghost as I was, decided to never break it. I slept under my covers to avoid seeing him, and I didn't see him again until the trip I took to Canada's Wonderland. That summer, I was riding the Leviathan when I swore I saw a man a few rows ahead of where I sat, with a rust-colored neck. The adrenaline I felt riding the coaster turned to panic. Time slowed and I wanted off the ride. This man stole my friend's eyes and was probably after mine too. Once I was off the roller coaster, I looked around frantically for him. I managed to catch him walking into a bathroom. Was he following me? I begged my mom to take me home as soon as possible. My friends and I decided to go hunting for the man one day, I think before the end of August 2026. They walked into a nearby forest and waited for an hour. We didn't know where he came from, but Emily pointed out he was around at times we felt the most emotional, and we were telling each other how scared we were of him, which had to count. Fortunately, he didn't show up. I was overwhelmed with chills and told the two I didn't want to search for the rusted man anymore and began walking home. 2027 and 2028 were my preteen years. I took my mind off of the rusted man by focusing on my favorite shows and musical artists. For the sake of getting all the details down, I watched a lot of Simpsons Gumball, and this show called Came Done that went viral. In 2027, the music I listened to was a rapper named Pestilence 40 and a pop singer named Rhonda Miller. In the spring of 2028, I realized I was asexual and aromantic, meaning I didn't feel a sense of attraction towards anybody. I spent a lot of time researching my favorite things while I'd overhear my parents freak out over a war that involved China. I have a hard time remembering anything more about said war. The next time I saw the Rusted Man was shortly after I turned 13. In 2029, I was going through the pictures of my trip to Chicago, and at the bottom of my camera roll, there was a picture of his face. I jumped. When did that happen? I went into the Photos Details tab and found out it was dated February 5th, 1950. Odd, considering there's no way the phone I was using was manufactured anytime around that year, but I sent it to my friends. Both of them responded by telling me the image was coming up blank. I went back to my gallery intending to study the image closely, but it was gone. It had become lost media. A lot of the time after that were just casual memories of being dropped off at school, playing GTA 6 with friends, watching my favorite shows, listening to my favorite music, and joking about secret wars on Reddit, and a viral app called BL. Nothing much about the man. That is, until sometime in 2032 when I saw him walk by my bedroom window while I was right in the middle of a depressive episode. The chills I felt were one of the 4 emotional highs I felt that year. For the rest of the year, and for a lot of the following year, I felt numb, anxious, and mentally vacant. I barely cared about anything, not even the man or the flu epidemic going on at the time. My friends were going through the same thing, so we exchanged affirmations and shared quotes from singers who were part of an indie wave trying to bring music back to its Billie Eilish phase. I was pretty much over the man at that point. I cared so much less about him, I considered seeking him out to let him kill me. I didn't think I was going to make it to 2034 anyway, so why not? Then in 2033, my depression began to lift, and I started to dread the thought of him again. I started drawing pictures of him and posted them on BL. Over the course of months, I gained a following who claimed to have seen him too. Some told me they saw him in their dreams. Some told me they spotted him in a crowd, and others saw him in the window of a house they happened to be driving or walking by. Then there were a few people who told me they saw him running across roads and ripping eyeballs out of the heads of homeless people. By the end of the year, I had 10,000 followers. In 2034, articles were being published about him. He became one of those big internet mysteries with dozens of videos and posts revolving around him and his actions, with some specific autobiographical drawings of mine being used as artistic renditions. Some people made and posted highly vivid AI-generated videos of him performing various tests, like midnight break-ins, murders, and to be jokingly relatable, cooking and cleaning. The videos looked like big-budget movies, and as I watched each of them, I got a deeper sense of dread. I avoided watching the videos altogether as they began to scare the hell out of me. There was a popular form of technology at the time that let people share thoughts and feelings with others. They were little chips attached to helmets that you could wirelessly connect to each other. Aside from joking around with my friends, I used it to let people feel exactly how I felt during my encounters with him. I told them I hoped we'd get to a point where we'd be able to share memories with others in order to give them the full observer experience. In the fall of 2036, the FBI announced they were on the case of the Rusted Man after a string of murders across the US left victims without their eyeballs. I was overwhelmed with chills as I read the announcement. It was official confirmation of the Rusted Man's existence. I called the police, reporting my encounters with the Rusted Man. They told me they'd keep a lookout for him. Throughout 2037, 2038, and 2039, I'd hear reports about more victims being robbed of their eyes, yet no official photos or video of the Rusted Man ever surfaced. There were dozens of fakes all over the internet that were debunked, and I just wanted an official one. At the same time, however, I wanted it to be a hoax. I wanted it to turn out the man with a rusted face was just a murderer trying to become notorious by cosplaying an internet legend. I distracted myself from the whole fiasco by keeping up with the mission to Mars. In 2040, the lack of photo and video evidence of the Rusted Man began to bug me. That was until that summer when something was found. The FBI released security cam footage showing a man with a rust-colored face beating a police officer in a parking lot. His face resembled a mask, but looked organic at the same time. It was him. I knew it in my gut. Comments from other victims commented the same. That's him. I can't believe it took this long to get official footage of him. Yep, definitely him. Right down to his eyes. I feel cold watching that. Yes, that is the man who stalked me when I was 7. I too felt cold watching it. I deleted it from my search history and closed all my blinds. He was real. It was confirmed. I knew I needed to hide away, even though I hadn't seen the man since I was 13. My friends told me they felt the same way. The early 2040s were full of fear and doing as many things from home as possible. I made most of my money from making videos about music and movies. Occasionally, I'd make a video about the man, but only whenever he hit the news. I decided to share part of my revenue with my friends, so they didn't need to go out as much and risk another encounter with the man. Luckily, most people just ordered food online anyway, which solved the hunger thing. Sharing revenue with my friends became more important amidst a recession I only barely remember taking place in 2041 through 2043. I began to go outside more in late 2043, early 2044. The man hadn't been in the news for a year, so I joked the FBI had caught him and found out he was an alien. I found it weird he was only reported in Canada and the US. Maybe it wasn't so weird in actuality, but it was as if something was missing, like he was present in other places, but no reports had gotten out. I chalked it up to a random assumption and went along with my days. In the summer of 2044, I discovered a conspiracy forum dedicated to the Rusted Man. I can remember some of the post titles quite vividly. The Rusted Man, what is his face really made of? Is the Rusted Man the last resort for the US government on homelessness? DNA connects the Rusted Man to Dinah Cortez. I got out of that forum right away and blocked it from my search results. There was no reason to read any of that baloney. Throughout 2045, pop singers would insert references to the Rusted Man into their promotional music videos, but they usually either butchered him, had him get arrested, or portrayed him as a metaphor for the singer's own mental health issues. While I was glad he was getting attention, I kinda regretted giving him so much coverage, as it meant I had to hear about him everywhere all the time. I brought it up to Emily. Yeah, but I feel the same way, she said. I sometimes wish I could hit a button and give everyone amnesia for a week. While I kept hearing about him, I sure as hell hadn't seen him for a while. I thought I was free of him. Maybe he just left me alone. Maybe he leaves certain people alone after teasing them for a bit. I was wrong. On one especially sunny afternoon in September 2045, I was jogging along the sidewalk on a road not too far from where I lived. I couldn't help but notice the sky looked like a painting, a really good one at that. As I stared up at the oddity, I bumped into somebody, my face colliding with theirs. Their complexion was odd. It was rough, and almost felt like duct tape at the same time. I looked at him and told him I was sorry, but that's when I saw his face. It was him, the man with the rusted out face. I went cold and felt I needed to force myself to step backwards. When I did, the man let out a chilling shriek. It sounded metallic, but like the climax of a sneeze at the same time. He stared into my eyes, which began to tingle. My heart dropped and I broke the stare, turning around and sprinting along the sidewalk. Once I got home, I shut all my curtains, reported the man to the police, and texted my friends about the encounter. All I could think was, how long do I have to go through this? At least I was 29 years old, so people would believe it when I say it happened to me. I wasn't a kid anymore, but even then, I wish the Rusted Man was nothing more than a normal childhood hallucination. I went to my doctor for my eyes, just to make sure they were all right. He found an odd transparent substance under each of my eyelids, and referred me to a specialist. Some tests were done and I was told substance was the same one found in every crime scene involving the Rusted Man. They concluded I needed to be quarantined in my home for upwards of 20 years. I'm not kidding, that was the protocol. During quarantine, the man never showed up at or in my house. I could only wonder what he was doing other than probably killing somebody. I dreaded the idea of him showing up. I had nightmares once a week. Other than that, I still had access to the internet, so I watched as society developed while I was unable to go outside. A political uprising happened in favor of conservatism in 2046, which was met with equal push from the liberal side due to claims of violence towards those that wanted science to be taught in school. In 2050, Russia collapsed and fell into a civil war, but was avenged by China and India. By 2053, we were able to use MRI-like devices to project imagined images onto a screen. I ordered one for $100 and used it to recreate my memories of the rusted man and share them online. They were chilling to look at, so I considered not opening them for a while. In 2056, a major cyber attack brought down various websites. Luckily, no archival sites were taken down. Personally, I just spent the years making content and building a fanbase that sent me emails all the time. The switch from foldable phones to perfectly flexible phones in the late 40 seconds was fun. The phasing out of laptops due to phones becoming ever more useful was welcome. Things were pretty normal for that stretch of time, aside from the quarantining. I got pretty used to it though, and developed a habit of jogging on the spot for exercise. Throughout the 2050s, the rusted man made the news once a month. Throughout the early 2060s, he was making the news once a week. I wanted to look at the news less often, but I had to because it was important. It didn't matter how dreadful the increased volume of attacks was. Throughout the mid-2060s, reports came out about him destroying AIs, possibly because he didn't have high-tech glasses that identified AIs as one of its features, so he likely thought they were human. This led to an upping of security around AIs and advancements in their security protocols. By 2067, a report came out stating less bots were getting attacked by him. The man spent the rest of the 2060s and the beginning of the 2070s continuing his murder spree without much to be discovered about him. He was still an unsolved mystery and had become one of the most notorious figures of the 21st century. In 2071, reports about the rusted man's eye thieving became daily, and worldwide, major news talking heads began pushing the idea the rusted man is an alien who could attack a major celebrity or politician. Of course, celebrities and politicians upped their security tenfold during the mid-2060s due to the weekly attacks, so nothing could go wrong, right? That's what I thought, until May 2073, when a famous rapper named Fenny Don was found dead inside his Atlanta mansion without both his eyes. The security cameras caught the rusted man popping out of nowhere, restraining the rapper to their bed, removing their eyes, then vigorously ripping their brain out of their head. It was mortifying, and many people said they refused to watch it, recreate it, share it, etc. But everybody had to have seen the screenshot of the man standing in the rapper's bedroom 1 second after appearing out of thin air. It was shared all over the internet for months. The video itself was proof this guy could teleport and move objects telekinetically. The Pentagon released a report soon after, which included speculation about the rusted man's intentions. It was thought the rusted man was after people's eyes because they are impossible to reproduce alone, and nothing beats them in terms of perception. That wasn't the only thing I was wondering, however. Why he needs them is still very unknown, and multiple theories so far haven't passed the merit test. There it was. It needed to be figured out soon, because I wanted to know. I anticipated the day the truth came to be known. I needed the damn closure so bad. In March 2074, I started to thinking of my life as wasted by the rusted man, and my fear of him. I was 59, and rotting from the inside out. I didn't open up to my friends about it until I started slipping into a depression in May, despite my quarantine having just ended. That was when my friends told me the most assuring thing they could. Remember the little things, and we're here for you. Emily said, yeah, all we can do now is whatever we want to do, because we're probably going to be killed at some point anyway. Ryan said, it was cliche, but true. The emptiness lingered on through mid-2075. Then it sorta lifted. Maybe I was desensitized, but at least I had my friends and the emotionally cathartic shows I was watching. By the end of that year, I was thinking of upping my dosage of antidepressants. Emily, Ryan, and I were hanging out a lot more to make each other happier in spite of our emptiness, and fear the rusted man would barge into our homes, randomly appear on the foot of our beds, or chase us down a road. And it was working. On December 29th, I felt the emptiness lift. Who needed pills? We just needed to stick together like we always had. Emily suggested covering our heads to confuse the man, but I pointed out we'd need to know when he would arrive. We can't wear bags on our heads forever. We'll figure something out, Emily said. In mid-April 2076, I was eating dinner when I started hearing a loud rushing water-like sound coming from outside. I went outside to check out what was going on, but I couldn't find the source. I watched as my next door neighbor walked out onto their front porch, then the neighbor directly across the street stepped onto their porch. Both of them looked up at the sky with looks of confusion. I checked the news later on to find the sound was being reported all over Canada, all over the US, in the UK, Australia, Spain, Japan, South Africa, Chile, then pretty much everywhere else. The entire world was hearing this thing. The noise went on for days, then weeks. Comments under articles were mixed about the sound. Some thought it was annoying, others enjoyed its fuzziness. Both Emily and Ryan both told me they thought it was ear-piercingly horrible. Comedians joked about aliens, and NASA started to theorize it was actually extraterrestrial in nature. The sound finally faded in June 2076, and Emily, Ryan, and dozens of people across the internet expressed their relief. Around August 10, 2076, I was mowing my lawn when I noticed him standing across the street from my house. The rusted man. He stared my way, not moving an inch. As he stared sinisterly into my soul, I was overwhelmed with chills. But that wasn't it. I noticed something off about my surroundings. The trees, bushes, grass were no longer moving in the wind. The man even looked static himself. I couldn't help but stare at the oddity. Everything that should have been moving just seemed so two-dimensional all of a sudden. I pulled my digital glasses out of my pocket and attempted to call the police, but the numbers weren't in the right order. Attempting to dial 911 brought up a different combination of 3 numbers each time. I sprinted back inside and shut all the curtains again except for the ones in the kitchen, as they refused to move when I tried to shut them. Over the following week, the fleeting rushing sound returned to the sky. This time, it sounded familiar, not just because I heard it for 2 months straight not too long before. It seemed as if I had always known that sound. I realized it more and more as the weeks went on. In early September 2076, I went to the museum. On my way there, I noticed the trees were still static and fake looking. I tried my best to not even think about them, but rather on the technology of the early 21st century. When my phone decided to work, I texted Emily. Apparently, I had missed 20 messages from her, but I was too freaked out about my surroundings. Does anything seem off about the trees? I asked. No, they look fine to me, Emily responded. They look fake all of a sudden. The grass too, I said. Also, I feel like I've heard the buzzy static lawn before this year, and sometimes my phone looks off, which is why I missed your messages. Have you told your doctor about this? She asked. I hadn't, but I decided to make an appointment. On the day of the appointment, my doctor immediately diagnosed me with schizophrenia, but I knew there was more to what I was experiencing. The day after my visit to the doctor, Emily and Ryan came over. I showed them the trees across the street and the grass on my lawn. I told them how fake it looked to me. They told me it all looked normal. They didn't notice anything unusual like I did, which only made my obsession deeper. I looked around at everything for a while. My friends tried to convince me to do stuff with them, but I refused. Eventually, they left, and I stood there, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Every day, I stood in my front yard for 2 hours, looking at the trees, bushes, and grass. In late September, the buzzy static began to feel more localized to my heart, and I could hear a subtle whooshing along with the buzzing. It too came from the sky. By mid-October, the sound dissipated, but the ambient noise was still going strong. People would walk past my house like there was no sound coming from the sky at all. On October 15, 2076, I stood on my front lawn, listening to the whooshing noise and watching the trees cease to convince me they were normal. Then, the whooshing sounded localized to my lawn, and then it hit me. None of this is real. My life never really happened. My friends never really existed. I'm about to come out of a dream. Suddenly, I immediately alternated from standing to laying down on my lawn without having moved a muscle. I was staring up at the sky, which was getting brighter. I could feel my heart beating. I began to hyperventilate, as this was new to me. I couldn't remember my waking life at all. Where the hell am I going? I looked over at the unrealistic trees, then everything went blurry. Pain erupted in my chest. Then I was lying on a stretcher. I wanted to move, but I was in shock. What the hell? What's happening right now? Then I remembered my life, my real life, then the drive, the crash. I fished my phone out and looked at the date, May 23rd. I checked the calendar for the year. It was 2023. I was overcome with a heavy feeling of sadness. I thought I had spent 53 years being friends with two amazing people, but I was really just unconscious for a short time. I can't stop thinking about Emily and Ryan. The whole thing about the rusted man was crazy, but some things will never make sense. Last Thursday, I was sweeping my room, still feeling like I had lost real friends, when I turned around to sweep near the door and saw the rusted man standing right outside my room. I went cold. It was really him. That rust-colored face, those eyes. I thought I was hallucinating at first. I knew I wasn't dreaming though, as you know when you're awake. When you're dead awake. The rusted man lunged at me, and before I could react, I was being tackled to the ground. This isn't a hallucination at all. Damn, dread overcame me as I struggled. Pain shot up through my back. At some point, I managed to get him off of me. Then I sprinted into the living room and out the back door. I didn't have my phone with me, so I couldn't call the police. I looked back and saw the man's silhouette in the door frame. He lunged at me through the dark of the night. My heart sunk and I sprinted away, but tripped and fell face first onto the grass. Not a second later, I felt a painful thump. I woke up in the hospital with that unexplainable liquid under my eyelids. The liquid I had in the same spot in the dream. My heart sank even further. Great. The doctors told me I'd be going in for testing and asked me what happened. I told them, describing the man to them as well, but in a plausible way. He probably had face paint on or something that made his face look like rusty metal. Later that day, one of the doctors told me my tests have been scheduled for the night. Just the night before, I heard Emily's voice in a dream, but she was nowhere to be seen. I woke up with tears streaming down my face, wondering why the rusted man had to be real, but not the two people who were always there for me, or the other victims of the man himself. My curtains have been shut for days now. I've informed my neighbors of the madman, and the police told me they're still on the lookout. All I want to know is who this man is, what he wants with my eyes, how much longer I'm going to live with him stalking me, and how dreaming truly works. My wife, Laura, and I moved to Haydenfield late May of this year. Neither of us knew too much about the town before we moved in. Laura was a traveling nurse and decided it was finally time to settle down at an actual clinic and get more sustainable hours. Haydenfield just happened to be the closest town and had the most affordable houses near her clinic. As for me, I just create mock-ups of websites for different companies. All my work is done wherever my computer is, so I really didn't mind moving wherever Laura felt happiest with. So when Laura told me about Haydenfield, I was just as excited as she was. The whole town basically consisted of a small subdivision with a connected cul-de-sac, the only other building being a small family-owned department store down the road. The average age of a resident in Haydenfield was well into their late 60s and 70s. It was quiet, old and secluded, surrounded by a beautifully dense woodland. It was perfect for just the two of us. Our house was a 2-story continental nestled right into the center of the main cul-de-sac. It had a bit of age to its design, but it was well kept and maintained. Besides, it was a cheap buy too. The previous owner had passed away from natural causes a few months prior. Her name was Nancy. She made it until 73. The in-home death didn't bother Laura or I very much. Seeing death was part of Laura's occupation, and for me, I guess the thought of death never bothered me much. Our move-in date was a pretty standard affair. Our whole previous life had fit into a mid-sized storage van. We started unpacking our belongings from the van sometime in the early afternoon. That day, it wasn't until the late evening that we had all the boxes inside our new home. To see all of our lives' possessions laying on the floor and not even filling up a single empty living room left us feeling some sort of way. I'd like to say it was the feeling of hope and excitement for having a new start, but in reality it was that sense of feeling you'd get when you realize that all your worldly possessions really meant nothing when properly laid out. Yet instead of dealing with that foreboding sense of dread, it's easier to just collect more clutter to pretend your life has more substance than it actually does. That's what Laura and I agreed on anyway. Once the unpacking was finished up, we kicked back on our tiny little sofa. We were on a little island of boxes in an otherwise empty living room. We didn't have too much to say to each other that night. The long day of shepherding boxes from one place to another left us exhausted. It was right about that time when we had finally closed our eyes together that we heard a knock on the door. It took me a few seconds, but I forced myself up. I could feel my back crack just under my skin at every little movement. I knew I'd be sore for a while, but I still pressed onto my front door. I unlocked our deadbolt and pulled open the thick wooden frame. "Hello, neighbor," a voice had filtered out towards me. It was an aged voice with the consistency of sandpaper. My eyes locked with the gaze of my visitor. It was just an elderly old man. His face was weathered with deep canyons of valleys of wrinkles. Deep shadows of the setting sun casted his face in black silhouettes that displayed the contours of his age. He wore an ebony black wide-brimmed hat with a dark overcoat that hung over his slender shoulders. He smiled with all the effort it took for a man who had already hit that venerable old age of carelessness. "Hey, sorry, we just moved in," I replied. "I don't think we've met yet. Is there anything I can do for you?" I asked the aged senior. He just shook his head in steady dismissal. No, nothing like that. I just wanted to give you a proper welcome to Haydenfield. My name's John Clark. I'm the block president here." He extended one of his lanky hands towards me. I took his hand in mine and shook it. His skin felt like tan leather, but his grip was strong. "Well, thank you for the welcome. Sorry we didn't have time to meet with the neighbors yet. We had a pretty busy day." John tightened his lips and nodded in understanding. "Nonsense. We should be apologizing to you both. Had we been younger, we'd have helped you out with those boxes. I think those times are long past us now, though." John gave a half-hearted chuckle. "Listen, we pride ourselves in this town for our hospitality. If you need anything at all, please don't hesitate to ask. My wife Mary and I love having company, and we live in that blue house right next door." I gave a small tired smile back to the old man. "Thanks, John. I'll pass that on to my wife." "Good. Tell you the truth, none of us even lock our doors at night. I promise you, if you need anything at all, just walk right in." His smile faltered with just a twitch at the end of his words. His eyes focused deep into mine. "Well, I appreciate that offer. I promise we'll knock first, though." I gave a half-hearted laugh. The old man's expression didn't change. "Whatever makes you feel more comfortable here. Just remember, always keep hospitality first. Around here, we're all guests within each other's homes." He squeezed my hand tightly, making me realize that he had never let go of me in the first place. "Be safe." His leathery hand tightened over mine one last time before he let go. The old man dipped his chin slightly in a small bow of respect, his wide-brimmed hat dipping below his eyes and casting his face into total darkness. "Our doors are open for you, Gregory, at any time, no matter the hour." With that, John swung around and turned back towards my driveway. His black overcoat billowed off of his small frame with beautiful grace. I squinted my eyes towards him, trying to find the words to the strange feeling I had over the situation. Something about that interaction had given me a terribly uncomfortable feeling. I couldn't place my finger on it, though. I slowly shut my door and locked the deadbolt behind the old man. I shook off the nerves that tumbled down my spine and returned back to the barren living room of my new home. Laura had found herself laying half asleep on the couch, her body sprawled across the cushions. "Who was that?" Her small voice murmured out towards me. "A neighbor. His name's John. He lives in that blue house right next to ours with his wife." Laura twisted her body and stretched out on the empty couch, yawning. Her voice pushed past her inhale. "Oh, was he nice?" she asked through her tired tone. "Yeah, he just seems a little strange." I paused for a moment, judging how much space was left on the couch past Laura's small frame. "Let's head upstairs before we both pass out down here. Otherwise, one of us is going to end up sleeping on the floor." Laura laughed before pushing herself up. We both went upstairs to our unfurnished bedroom. The only thing we had set up was a queen-size box spring with a matching mattress that lay on top of it. The box spring had found itself laying haphazardly on the hardwood of our floor. We ended up both sluggishly making our usual nest of pillows and blankets. Before long, we were both blacked out for the night. It wasn't until a few hours later I had felt a pressure on my chest that was shaking me awake. I looked over to the small silhouette of Laura next to me, the silvery moonlight from our window casting an ethereal light over her figure. "Greg, wake up." Laura's voice sounded panicked and subdued. I could hear how terrified she was even underneath her hushed tone. What's going on?" I replied. My hand had tried to wipe away the sleep from my eyes. My body still felt exhausted from the physical labor we had just finished. I heard the downstairs door slammed shut. I think someone broke in. I looked at Laura and held my breath. I was trying to hear if anything else in our home was making noise. All I could hear was the throbbing of my own heartbeat. The rest of the house was dead quiet. Not a single creak of the aged wooden floorboard had met itself in contrast to our mutual silence. "I'll go check it out," I whispered over to Laura. She let go of my chest, and I lurched myself upward. I had wished I had a gun or a bat or anything I could have used to defend myself with, but I had nothing more than the mattress on the floor to protect myself with. But I swallowed that feeling and pressed on. I slowly opened up my bedroom door and crept downstairs. Nearly every step I took sent a loud creak that echoed its way throughout the empty house. I kept telling myself that nothing could be inside our home and be this silent, not unless it was standing completely still. I entered our moonlit living room and flipped on the lights. Nothing. I pressed forward into the kitchen and did the same thing. Nothing. Finally, the foyer. Nothing. I looked over to the front door and saw the deadbolt latch still flipped towards the locked position. I felt my body relax, my shoulders slumped down in relief. I took a deep breath and wandered back up into our bedroom. There's no one down there. The door is still locked. Laura just stared at me for a moment. "I know what I heard, Greg." Someone slammed that door shut. I could see the absolute resolve in Laura's eyes. I knew she fully believed in what she had heard. "Listen, I don't know. Everything's locked up tight down there. No one's getting in without breaking down that door." I laid back down on the mattress next to my wife. She just stared towards our bedroom door, as if she had expected something to break through it. Both of our physical fatigues ended up hitting their limits a few moments later, and we found ourselves asleep once again. But the same surprise came again and again, night after night. Laura would wake me up sometime, just after 2 a.m., and tell me she heard our front door slammed shut. I would head downstairs, see nothing, and check the lock to find everything in order. It wasn't until the evening of the 4th night, well after we had finished moving in, that I had made a disturbing discovery with our door. The lock didn't actually work. The deadbolt didn't transition over no matter how hard you twisted the locking mechanism. The door had been unlocked every single night since we had first moved in. I was at a crossroads. I could break the news to Laura and have her lose even more sleep than she had already lost, or make the decision to just handle things myself and buy a new deadbolt from the department store in the morning. So I did what I thought was best. I told Laura I would sleep on the couch that night and keep an eye on the door. I didn't tell her about the broken lock. She went upstairs to our bedroom. While I laid down on our couch, I decided to grab a kitchen knife for protection, just in case. I stole the largest one that I could find from our knife set. It was about the deadliest thing I could think of. I positioned our couch so that it faced our foyer. My vision was dead set on our front door for the first few hours. I did my best to keep them open that night, but a few hours in, and my eyes felt heavy. My mind had found itself halfway to dreamland and halfway to reality. So when I watched the dimly lit front door in front of me slowly crack its way open, I couldn't muster up the energy to move. Even when my brain had begun to scream at me to do something, my body was paralyzed. I could only watch as the brass handle of the door slowly unlatched itself, and the thick wooden door creaked its way open. The darkness from outside had spilled forward. The shadows casted an uncanny black shade throughout our foyer. Despite my best efforts, I couldn't make out a single figure in the emptiness of the void outside. But I could see one thing. I could see an arm that had extended its lanky fingers around the exterior of our doorknob. It was gangly, with a pale red hue that seemed unnaturally colored. Spindles of black veins intertwined themselves with knots of tumor-like growths all along its skin. The arm was so thin it could be mistaken for a discarded tree branch. Yet, The thing's arm was impossibly long for its slender and atrophied frame. The forearm alone had to have been at least 4 or 5 feet in length. Its upper arm was even more so. The limb stretched deep into the darkness of the night outside. I couldn't even see the shoulder that the stick-like appendage should have been connected to. The entirety of the creature's body was completely cloaked in the shadows from outside. Meanwhile, I watched helplessly as the door creaked its way more and more open. The door had nearly reached the limits of its hinges before it paused. A few seconds passed before the fingers of the creature had tightened around the brass door handle. With a single tug, the door flew backwards. The full force of the wood slammed shut with such an impact that the intensity of it alone shook the house. I finally snapped out of my paralysis. My heart was racing, and I could feel a cold sweat pour down my forehead. I heard my bedroom door bang open, and the thudding of my wife's feet sprint downstairs towards me. "Greg," she yelled out as soon as she saw me. I looked at her and knew immediately she could see the expression on my face. The absolute petrified expression. "Greg, what happened? Did you see anything?" I couldn't formulate the words out of my mouth. I just nodded. We stayed up the whole night with each other. As soon as the department store opened, I made the drive over. Funnily enough, the local store didn't sell any type of door lock, but ever determined, I drove out the extra hour to a chain store and got exactly what I needed. By the early afternoon, I was taking off my old deadbolt and affixing on the new one. My tired mind was barely able to comprehend the task I was doing. "Hello, neighbor," a raspy voice had called out from behind me. I turned towards the blistering sun and saw the outline of John wearing his wide brim hat right behind me. "What are you doing?" I sighed and continued on. "I'm fixing up our locks. I just noticed last night that they weren't working." I pushed my fingertips against my eyelids and tried to force some of my exhaustion out. "I wouldn't worry about that. None of us ever lock up our doors." John continued to stare down at me. I couldn't make out his expression through the blinding light that backlit his slender figure. "Yeah, well, I'd just feel safer if I did," I muttered to myself. I grabbed the new lock and placed it into the now empty hole of the front door. "He won't be." The hospitality of an open door policy is what keeps this neighborhood safe. Always has been, ever since I was a kid. A lot of people had to get hurt to realize that. A silence enveloped us as I continued about my task. "Gregory, if you finish what you're doing, you're going to get yourself and your wife hurt. Now I can't say much more than that, but you need to trust in your neighbors." I scoffed under my breath before I turned towards John. I created a visor for my eyes using my hands. The makeshift shade helped me see the dour expression on my neighbor's face. "Listen, John, I get it. You're a close community here, but we've been having issues with our front door opening since we got here. That's stopping tonight." John slowly shook his head in disappointment. "I can't compel someone to have good manners. Compelled hospitality is no hospitality on behalf of the compulsor. I'd be damned if I forced your hand here, but there are things out there that don't like locked doors. They've got to feel welcomed, otherwise our whole neighborhood falls apart." I felt my brow furrow as I looked closer at John's face. I felt a kinship of understanding between us. I felt like he knew more than he was letting on. "What's going on here?" I whispered up to the old man. "It's unbecoming to talk about someone behind their back." He paused. "Mary's making a pie for you tonight. I'll leave it on your doorstep. Don't eat it. It's for your guests tonight." John took a deep breath and muttered, "I hope it'll be enough," under his breath. The old man swung his back towards me and began to walk back towards his house. I ignored him and fixed up the door. I made sure it locked up tight as soon as I was finished. Sure enough, just a few hours after Laura had returned home, we had a knock on our door. I opened the door and discovered a large steaming fresh apple pie. It had found its home resting upon our stoop. A small card lay near it. It read, "For the guests of Gregory and Laura Adams from the neighborhood of Haydenfield. We apologize for making you feel unwelcome tonight. Please accept our deepest apologies. Very respectfully, the Clarks. P.S. Gregory, a proper dessert should always be set out on your kitchen table in case any guests make an unexpected visit. May you have room on your dining room table to place this in case that may happen. God bless." John, Laura, and I both gave each other a strange glance. "What's all that about?" she asked, flipping the card around in her hand. "No idea. I replied, examining the pie in my hands. The aroma wafted over our home in the most pleasant of ways. Should we have a slice? Laura leaned down and smelled the apple cinnamon scent that had emanated from the glaze inside. I pulled it away from her. Something in me told me that John knew something we didn't. I had no idea what was going on, but I knew what the card said, and I knew what I had seen the night prior. Let's just leave it on the table tonight. We can double check with the neighbors tomorrow just to make sure they actually made it. Otherwise, I don't know if we can trust it, you know. I tried my best to explain it away, but Laura gave me a skeptical look. Thankfully, she just shrugged it off. I placed the card and the pie right on the center of the dining room table and headed upstairs. Laura managed to fall asleep before I did. That night, I felt my eyes stare deep holes into my eyelids. No sense of drowsiness had washed over me. I could only think of that strange, spindly arm that I had seen the prior night. Like clockwork, just after 2 a.m., I had heard a jingle come from my downstairs foyer. The doorknob was shaking. It was slow at first, but then got more frantic. I gripped onto my bed covers and prayed that the lock would keep whatever that thing was away. But as the door handle jiggled more and more fiercely, that prayer fell away. I could hear the door begin thudding in its own frame as something lurched against it. At this point, Laura must have heard it as well. She shot up in bed and looked over at me. "Greg, what the hell is that?" Something began crashing against the door. A chorus of strange voices began screaming from outside our home. Their harmony created an ethereal echo that filled every inch of our home. I glanced over to our bedroom's window and saw several spider-like hands pressed against the glass. Their skin was the same twisted red hue that I had seen the night prior. Their gnarled fingertips had pressed so tightly against the glass that the glass had begun to crack under their grip. The same crackling noise had filled our entire home, as every window in our house had simultaneously begun to experience the same fate. Laura's eyes had fixated themselves on the gangly hands outside. Tears had welled up in her eyes as her voice faltered and fell away into a low whimper. I didn't know what to do, so I reached over to her and pulled her tight against my chest. "Don't look at them," I whispered to her over and over again. I wasn't sure if I was speaking to her or to myself. I heard the front door splinter open under the weight of something incredibly massive. A tremendous thunder of thudding and thumping had filled the lower floor. Soon to follow was the sounds of every window in our home shattering open one by one. I squinted my eyes open for just a moment to see the bedroom window crack and explode into shards of glass. Broken shards had flown their way towards me and my wife. I closed my eyes to protect them from the slivers of flying glass. Hands from outside had begun to stretch their way into our home. They seemed to lurch their way in our direction, as if they could see us. I closed my eyes again and began praying. The thudding from downstairs had found its way into our kitchen. The sounds of cabinets clattered open and shut. A symphony of voices floated their way into the halls of our home. I was left waiting for the feeling of those lanky hands to wrap over me. I was preparing myself to be dragged out of my home at any moment, to feel them pull me right through the broken glass-filled window and into the mouth of whatever those arms were connected to. But instead I was greeted by silence. The banging had stopped. All the noises had stopped. I could hear Laura crying in my arms, but that was it. I opened my eyes and saw nothing more than the shattered window of my bedroom greeting me. I quickly picked up a large piece of glass and wrapped it up in one of my socks before getting up to my feet. Room by room I cleared. Every window in our home was broken, every single one. I got to our front door and saw its frame completely knocked off its hinges. Broken splinters of wood lay scattered across the hardwood floor. Yet the thing that got me the most was that the pie was gone. We stopped locking up our doors after that night. Now we're always prepared to entertain any guests that might show up, no matter the time. All I ever wanted was for my wife and I to live comfortably, but the longer we stayed together, the higher our bills increased. We'd already fought off debts from college, barely scraping by. Even after we paid them off, we were only able to afford a tiny apartment on the outskirts of New York City. Sidewalks lay cracked everywhere, while condemned buildings sat sadly against their crooked foundations. Crooked lampposts would hang only by electrical wires. Graffiti marked every street corner and bland art that existed without rhyme or reason. Homeless people could be found on every street corner, a constant reminder of what would happen if my wife and I failed to keep up with our payments. However, I managed to make somewhat decent money as a plumber, but even then, it sometimes wasn't enough to deal with loan sharks, the hefty utility bills, food prices, and gas money. I was willing to do anything to get us out, and that is where I encountered gambling. I was willing to take the risks. I'd take any chance to obtain a reward, even just a small one. It started out with just a handful of poker games. Then I moved on to scratch tickets and slot machines. All I needed was enough to get by. Unfortunately, obtaining a payday from the casinos was impossible. I started growing desperate, which only led to more debt. The whole cycle sucked me down like Odysseus' ship in Charybdis Maw. And just like that, my relationship with my wife began to tear us apart. My wife and I were once so close together. Before we married, there would be days where we'd work together at wood shops, creating 3D prints of various sci-fi characters and video games. Other times, we'd study the components of circuits and use them to create crazy lighting displays. Whenever Christmas arrived, our wedding day was supposed to be the greatest day of our lives. Instead of relying on the help of others back like we did in college, we relied on ourselves. But my actions tore all that apart. I didn't know what else to do, either. A few nights ago, I arrived at my trashy apartment, having completed a 10-hour shift fixing the drains of several upper-class folks. I rested my hand on the knob, expecting the worst from my wife. Sighing, I pushed the door. The moment I did, she was already in the front hall. Her eyes were scrunched, and she was holding a bank statement, smacking it for emphasis. Care for an explanation, she demanded. I rubbed my temples, removing my scum-covered overalls, and plopping them right into the nearest laundry hamper. We locked eyes. Breaking eye contact with her would only ignite her anger further. She was holding another piece of evidence of my failures, my failure to strike it rich. All I could do was stand there sheepishly, tail tucked behind me, and wait to get ripped a new one. No words could come out of my mouth. She marched up to me, holding it in my face. Frank, you wasted $3,000 at the casino again, my wife bellowed. I set my toolbox down and washed the pipe gunk from my hands, looking down just for a bit. Turn around and look me in the eyes. Resting a hand on my eyes, I glanced over at her petite frame. Then I began to speak. We can live comfortably if you just give. Enough of the excuses. We nearly lost our apartment twice. By you betting on slots, you wasted our heating money on roulette. And now this. The landlord wants $4,000 in 2 weeks. And if we don't get this sorted out, we lose our apartment. I held up my hands reassuringly. Look, just let me figure this out. I'll think of some way to get the money. You'd better. Otherwise, we're getting a divorce. Got it. Without another word, I put on a casual outfit, exiting for some fresh air. Shutting the door behind me, I gazed back at the unpolished apartment number on the frame. Wincing, I clenched a fist and descended the rickety stairs. Eventually, my boots hit the cracked pavement, and I headed off. I stood outside a graffiti-covered subway station, pacing around, hands in my pockets. My fists constricted as I pounded a nearby wall. There's no way I would have been able to make that kind of money. Perhaps we're too unpredictable. Arcade machines were always rigged, and roulette was too high in stakes. Seeing red, I screamed and kicked a wall as hard as I could. My foot throbbed, and once I was done with my fit, I broke down sobbing. The sidewalk darkened with my tears. I pressed my head against it, clawing at it until my fingernails turned crimson. Then, I felt a tap on my shoulder. Wiping the tears away, I glanced over my shoulder. A card was lying on the floor. Its borders were covered in green dollar symbols. The rest of the card was a silver color shiny enough to reflect my face in it. Written in gold letters were the following: Ace's High Casino, win 1 round of blackjack, and earn $50 million. No monetary wager needed. Table 777. My eyes lit up. All I had to do was win 1 game of blackjack, and I'd be rich. Dimples formed on my cheeks, and I pumped my fist. I nearly clicked my heels in joy, but decided against it. I'd already caused enough of a scene already, and I wanted to make sure nobody knew my secret. When I flipped it around, it had an address also written in golden letters: Despite the address being in an unknown area, I still managed to pull it up on my phone's map and arrived without any struggle. The casino itself was a pigsty, to say the least. Smokers polluted the air and the prison gray interior. Slot machines with broken lights clicked and whirred while cheap dice clattered against tables with peeling felt. Meanwhile, the concrete floor was covered in colonies of roaches while neglected beer bottles sat against the rungs of several tables. The only thing that was kept well was the bar, and a room draped with navy blue curtains with golden sashes. Emblazoned above the doorway was the number 777. This was the first time I had entered a casino smiling. For once, I thought that this was my lucky night. When I pushed the curtains away, they revealed a room with ornate black wallpaper and assortment of oak desks and other furniture. The walls were covered in fine Baroque paintings. On the floor was a single blue carpet covered in opulent tapestry. I followed the back wall to a single dealer table coated in green felt. 2 seats were present with one patron taking the seat on the left. He was shaking with what I assumed was excitement. Behind him was the dealer, a trim man with long blonde hair and a top hat over his nose and eyes. He wore a dapper tuxedo free of blemishes that shimmered in the light of a single hanging glass lamp. His skin was pure and free of moles, glistening with slight amounts of glitter. "Why, hello there." The man spoke in a voice slicker than the gel in his hair. "Are you here to win big?" Unlike the loan sharks, his teeth were cleaner than a freshly washed plate. "Yup, deal me in," I said, straightening my back, shuffling into the last seat. The other player had his jaw locked together. His eyes were drooping and bloodshot. Sweat pooled around his brow like glass beads. Just like him, I always felt nervous about losing, so their reaction was understandable. You know the rules of blackjack. I deal out cards. You can say hit me if you want more cards. Get closest to 21 without going over. Dealer only draws 2 cards, and you can also surrender your cards for half your bet. When you don't want any more cards, say the word stand, the dealer said, shuffling the cards through his hands and manipulating them like a sculptor with a ceramic pot. I double blinked. Wager. What do I bet with? Play a game and I will tell you. The mysterious man focused on passing out his cards. First, he brought out 2 cards for himself and dealt 2 more to each player. Instantly, he flipped over his cards. A jack and a king. 20. I clutched the velvet-backed cards, seeing what I was dealt. A 10 and a 7 of hearts. I forced my face into a neutral smile. My stomach twisted. There was no way I could get 21 that easily. Surrender, I said, pushing my cards to the dealer. All he did was reshuffle the cards and toss me 2 more. They didn't even bother looking back up at me during the process. The other player started clutching his stomach. My smile vanished. I carefully looked over the left guy's cards. A 7 and a 2 of clubs. Hit me. The guy on the left choked out. An ace of spades. A total of 10. Sweat trickled down his head like a shower in April. His eyes welled up with tears, while foam developed around his mouth. I raised a brow, wondering what his deal was. I knew the stakes of gambling, but my sixth sense kept telling me something was just not right. No, that couldn't be true. Even if there was some kind of string attached or fine print I didn't read, I couldn't risk giving up that money. Besides, this might have been my only chance to obtain such a vast award without much risk. Hit me, the man wheezed. A 5 of hearts. His teeth chattered. While I waited for my turn, I stood up and walked around the room, getting a closer look at all the ornate gadgets and such. My eyes focused on a painting on the leftmost wall. It resembled a man in rich military regalia, but something made my hair stand on end. Their upturned white mustache looked damp, and their face sagged like they were crying. Linear, stick-like shadows were cast on the sleeves. Edging forward, they came into focus. Hands. I followed their forms outward, which extended into oily, dripping arms. Hush. A faint noise echoed from somewhere in the room. What? I mouthed, turning an ear to the source. Hush. It came from the painting. I backed away, hands out at my sides. Was someone dragged in that painting? Where are you going? You forgot to pay up. The dealer yelled back, hands slamming on the table and pulling out a sack of navy blue poker chips. I double-took. I thought the card said there was no monetary wager needed. There isn't. Then I looked at the ground. There was a second rug on the ground. The tapestry matched, but its patterns didn't match with the other rug. It was off-center from the rest of the decorations, like someone didn't even bother setting it up properly. Taking a closer look, I could hear faint whispers coming from it, too. When I looked back up, the guy on the left was gone. I rushed over, checking his cards. A total of 25. Swallowing saliva, I stood in confusion, wondering what to do next. I scraped my fingernails against my palms. I needed that money. If I didn't get it, I'd lose my wife and my apartment. And what about the loan sharks? Only God knew what would happen to me if I didn't pay up. What was I going to do? What would happen if I lost? Would I turn into another object just like the other guy? Or would I be in for a worse fate? That's because there isn't a monetary wager. I'm still taking half of what you owe. In my game, your payment is in pain. A sharp stab punched my left side. My left side felt heavier than before, like my veins were replaced with tungsten. I grabbed my fingers around my chest. The area around the pain almost felt solid like a tumor. Bushing around the area, I could make out a cylindrical mess. I tried to inspect it some more, but the pain overwhelmed me and I crumpled to the ground. I crouched down on all fours, trying to get back to my seat, but the pain froze me in place. Reaching out a hand, I called out for help. Nothing. Slithering away, I pulled back the curtains to the entrance of the casino. I spat on the ground from the bludgeoning pain. Don't feel out of luck. You can still surrender once more, and you still have 2 chances left. The dealer smiled, adjusting his hat. It was only a glimpse, but I caught a look at his upper face. His eyes were on his hat, and his forehead was blank. The dealer looked like they were plucked straight out of an Alice in Wonderland book. What or who is this dealer? Think long and hard about this. I saw you arguing with your wife. I clambered back to my seat. I still didn't know what that dealer did to me. Something in me forced me to get back up and keep playing. More questions ate at me the longer I played. How did he know that information? Then I remembered feeling a tap back at Grand Central Station, and the card that brought me here. He couldn't have been human. Was he some kind of demon? I didn't bother asking. There wasn't any way he would spill the beans about his nature. After what seemed like hours, I managed to ride back into my seat, slumping over the table like I had just had the worst hangover. Ready to try again, the charming man said, resting his chin on his interlocked hands. Reluctantly, I gave him a thumbs up. He took back the cards and began manipulating the split deck once more. I analyzed every move he made. None of the cards were tricked. He wasn't second dealing and didn't have any aces up his sleeve. Never revealed anything under the table either. The only thing that brought me reassurance was that he was honest. Still, keeping an eye out was critical. The dealer revealed his cards. 2 tens again, 1 of spades, 1 of hearts. His face was harder than diamond and glowed like one, too. Not a pleasing glow, but one that would hex anyone that dared gaze at it for too long. I looked at my cards, an ace and a 7, 18. Gripping my lower abdomen, I stayed crumpled in agony. The odds of getting a blackjack were slim, and the stabbing pain skewed my thoughts. Surrender, I wheezed. The words slipped out of my mouth like the dying breath of a wounded soldier. The dealer smiled, holding a pile of blue poker chips around him. He waved his hand over the mound and made an inaudible chant. Then they vanished. I held my hands over my face, bracing myself. Suddenly, the pain doubled, shifting to my right like a mudslide down a hill. Now I knew everything the previous player was going through. I vomited out something hard and blue, a poker chip. Suddenly, my guts turned and another 7 spilled out. My esophagus tied itself into knots more contorted than cobwebs. I forfeit. The man started to smile. Without these, with a thud, the hat-faced dealer pulled out a jar filled with a kidney and a piece of liver. They still were oozing with blood that plumed and fit their containers. I remembered how the dealer said that there was no monetary wager. He never said there wasn't a wager at all. I paid in pain, and my wager was my organs. You want them back? Win them. He set them back on the ground. Now there was no choice. My fate was sealed if I tried to leave. I started to shed tears. If I didn't get these organs back and fast, I was done for. Even if someone saw me passed out on the floor, finding donors for organs wasn't guaranteed. And even then, I'd be put further in debt. Nothing would be solved. Then again, was trying to beat this guy even worth it? No, the reward was too great. Taking a few deep breaths, I sat back down. Reluctantly, I asked that he proceed. The dealer drew out cards just like before. He took the cards and gave them a good shuffle. Plucking 2 cards out of the stack, he revealed them, a king and a 9. Another poker chip tumbled out my throat. I spat it out in a red and blue plastic heap, not paying attention to the mess I made. He handed me 2 cards, a jack and a 2. 12. Hit me, an ace. Aces could count as 1 or 11 depending on what other cards were drawn. I still had a fighting chance. Hit me, a 5. His dead stare tore at my soul. I scratched against the felt, the wounds in my fingers reopening. From the corner of my eyes, I could see him frowning. Are you going to play, or do you want all that money to go to waste? I gritted my teeth. Shut up. Hit me. Swallowing saliva, I watched the dealer play out my last card, a queen. You lose, the dealer said coldly, grabbing a pile of poker chips and holding them close. He waved his hand over the mound and made another incantation. Then they vanished once more, everywhere at once. Burning pain sears my skin, making me black out. When I wake up and feel my arms, they are covered in something hard, blue and plastic. My clothes were gone. I examined my extremities and my torso. My skin was missing and replaced with poker chips. They were shaped to fit every part of my body. Cracks filled with blood gushed out with each slight movement I made. Horrified, I spilled my guts. More poker chips slid out my throat. Piles of skin lay clumped on the side of the table in hideous pink and blood-red sheets. I think you know what's at stake now. 1 try left. Better make it count. You want to end up in an object for an eternity, he taunted. The rigidity of my plastic-coated skin made each movement expose more of the cracks, searing my muscles. I groaned as I raised myself up. Crimson liquid dampened the table. I pounded at the table. This was it. I either walked out with my money and saved my marriage and tied up all those knots, or I lost and suffered a fate worse than death. Giving up was not an option. I gave the mysterious man a death glare, not even bothered by his resistance. He plucks out 2 cards, a 9 and a 10. This was my chance. Then my cards were revealed, a 10 and a 2. Fingers rattling, I took a deep breath and let calmness seep into me. Hit me, I sputtered. Another 2. Huffing, I opened my mouth to speak again. The dealer just stared into me, tilting his head like a vulture waiting for roadkill. The poker chips rattled again, grinding against each other. Hit. I paused for a moment, recollecting my thoughts. At a value of 14, I needed at least a 6 to beat the dealer, but an 8 or higher would result in disaster. Gulping down another chaser of saliva, I spoke. Hit me. To my chagrin, a 5 slipped out of the hand. I was now tied, staring at the pile of skin and my other organs. I closed my eyes and shook in horror. An ace or a 2 were the only cards I could draw in order to win. I looked down at my cards, sweat dripping on the table. With a quick glance, I gazed at the eyes on the man's silk hat. Don't keep me waiting, the man demanded. I'd begun hyperventilating. His stare grew more intense the longer I waited. His confident smile turned into a frown of irritation. Eyebrows and mouth were twisted into a hideous snarl. He rattled his fingers against the dealing table. The cacophony made my ears go numb. Then I whispered my answer. Hit me. The man darted up, smiling back in anticipation. I'm sorry, what was that? I closed my eyes, expecting the worst. Hit me. I screamed at the top of my lungs. Then the last card was revealed. A 2. I'd won. My mouth dropped. The sheets of skin unfurled themselves and flattened over me. 2 organ jars spilled over, their contents rising in a beam of white and torpedoing back into my body. Immediately, I yelped at the top of my lungs, skipping my heels and doing a jig. I regained my strength, instantly looking around for traces of my prize. For several minutes, I wasn't able to uncover anything. Staring directly at the dealer's face, I asked him to reveal my prize. I don't have it with me, he said, blankly. Not listening, I scrutinized every inch of the room, looking behind his station, checking under the table, everything. I searched everywhere for my prize, my happiness dissipating. With each step I took, my smile faded even further, twisting into a frown. My nose crinkled. Where is the 50 million? I demanded, overturning the table, ripping off the ornate paintings, and yanking the tasseled rugs off the floor. You promised me $50 million if I beat you. Do you realize what's gonna happen to me if I don't get that money, you charlatan? The strange man just stood there, not even acknowledging my pleas. You promised me money. You're a thief, I roared, pointing an accusing finger at him. I only did this for my wife, to save my marriage. I almost gave up my life trying to help my family out. How can you take that away from me? The demon stuck his hands behind his back and shook his head. He rolled his eyes back in thought. Something was up with him. You aren't like the other gamblers, he said. Other gamblers, I said, stepping back. They all wanted the money for worthless things. A mansion with fountains and a view, hookers, a trip to Tahiti. He paced around me. His face was rather relaxed and calm. Never once did he lose eye contact with me, like you had so much determination to help your wife out that you would risk it all. I admire that. It took me a while to figure out that you were actually a kind-hearted person. I saw red and tried to punch him. He grabbed my fist, shoving it back. Listen to me. I understand your rage. There never was a prize in the first place. It was nothing but a lure to capture those that wasted their lives away. But there is one thing that you don't understand. I thrusted my hands back. You nearly killed me all for nothing. Yes, but that was before I saw you the way you really were. Listen to my words. Slowly, I relaxed my posture, but still remained firm. Why should I listen to you? I can help you out of your situation, the man said. My nostrils flared. You owe me money, you snake. You never needed the money in the first place. Taken aback, I retreated. What do you mean? My arms relaxed once more. You are a plumber, aren't you? I saw you come home from work, just barely catching a glimpse of your schedule. 40 hours a week for $38 an hour for 5 days a week. That's $3,648 a week for 2 weeks. You already have everything you need. Like you don't understand. They need $4,000. I pleaded. He wouldn't budge, trying to earn this money via dumb risks. And chances will not get you anywhere. Look at all the things that you've done wrong. Tears began to well up, and I wanted to change that. I wiped my eyes. But what am I supposed to do now? The only way you can earn that money is through grit and spit, he said, walking around me. You aren't going to find solace through good luck alone, and you already have the tools that some people don't have. If you give up now, you might as well have lost. Think about it. With those last words, he raised his hand and snapped it, disappearing without a trace. Slowly, I gathered my things and walked out of the casino, head hanging low. The following day, I sat outside an old woman's faucet, inspecting how to fix a leak. I wondered what the demon's words meant to me. Before I stuck the wrench up to a U-trap, I remembered my pay. If I worked the same amount of hours as before, I'd only make $3,648. But if I pulled off some overtime and worked several extra hours, I might just be able to pay off my debts. I started staying up much later than before. Not long after, my wife started to become suspicious. Eventually, she confronted me. Frank, you've been staying up late. Are you going back to the casinos again? She asked, hands on her hips. I closed my eyes. Instead of fear, calmness filled my veins, and my blood stilled. Not this time. I've been working overtime. Her face loosened up for just a moment before hardening back up. I held my hands up and motioned my palms downward. Listen, I have been horrible lately. All my gambling did was drown us in deeper debt. Her expression began to soften up again, her frown vanishing. I want to change things. We used to work so well together, doing everything to help each other. Instead of fighting against each other, it's time we made peace, and we bring us out of our debt together. I held out my hand for her to shake it. She kept her arm pulled back and folded like the pincer of a mantis. Inch by inch, she extended it and took it. The following day, my wife convinced me to go to therapy to get out of my addiction, which I gladly obliged. Simultaneously, she decided to start up another job working as an electrician. Day by day passed, and we pooled all our resources as one. Before our eyes, bills were paid and debt disappeared faster than floaters. Our financial status wasn't the only thing that changed. Her once crusty mood lightened up, and she began to smile more. She began to believe my words and began to respect the changes I made. And then we paid off our rent. We got a letter from our landlord saying that we now were even. The moment that letter came in, we embraced each other. The only question now was, what were we going to do with this extra money? Not too long ago, we ended up earning enough money to create another 3D project, this time of a companion cube. Day after day, we created more projects. Although we weren't as happy as our days back in college, we still could make the best with what we had. In retrospect, the hat-faced man put up a good fight, but I managed to come out of a casino with more than I came in with. It wasn't exactly money, but it wasn't worthless either.